Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Not Sick in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Not Sick Chapter 27. 7 Orphans. The tallest building in the village hidden in the rain was also one of the oldest. Though what was old for a Megakure wasn't truly old at all, unlike most of the other villages, a Megakure's seat of power hadn't stood for over 60 years, but a mere 30. It had been constructed at Hanzo the Salamander's command, when the man had finally begun his descent into paranoia and madness. Secured at the top of the tower, nearly 200 meters above the rest of the village, Hanzo had imagined himself safe from all but the most dedicated intruders. The tower was the third highest construct in the elemental nations. The only buildings overtaking it were a rarely visited temple in the Land of Earth and the palace of the Land of Lightning's daimyo. It had been constructed out of concrete and steel, proof against Aim's harsh weather, and its foundations had been augmented with a variety of seals for detecting intruders, seals that made the material impossible to cling to even with chakra, seals that burst open in a hail of razor-sharp knives and choking poison gas if they were improperly handled. During Hanzo's regime, they had been reinforced monthly by an entire corps of shinobi. None of this had been enough to even slow Pain when he had come for Hanzo as a god of revenge striding through the soaked streets of a Megakure. The man who had named the Sun-in had died with a whimper, his defenses worthless, and Nagato Uzumaki had taken up residence in his tower fortress. Moving there had been for the potent message, obviously, but also for purely practical reasons. From a Megakure's highest point, Pain could exert the most control over his paths should they ever need to defend the village. It was a monstrous testament to the engineering of a Megakure's people, and to Pain's own ingenuity. He had made a few improvements with his control of the fundamental forces of gravity. The tower was pure black, unmarred with neon or protruding pipes like most of a Megakure was, and it pierced the cloudy sky like a needle. Its seals were maintained solely by its owner. Rust sporadically colored its sides like barnacles on the skin of a corpse, and broad discs of metal jutted outwards at seemingly random intervals. It was an impregnable, formidable fortress in the dark, and a Megakure's god waited at the top, lord over all he saw. When a raisin shuriken and a bolt of ever-burning black fire struck its base simultaneously, all that grandeur vanished in an instant, along with the bottom 30 feet of the building. The tower fell, and Pain with it. The building tilted, and in a room at the very top, Madara Uchiha charged out of one of the walls. Several things happened as he sprinted forward atop the thin pool of water coating the room's floor. Konan turned towards him, shock clear on her face. Nagato grunted, his neck creaking as he twisted his head towards the Uchiha. And Itachi, who had been waiting for this moment in the shadows of the room's corner, acted. A flare of black fire burst in the darkness, and Konan whirled, paper splitting en masse from her body. The black flames crashed against the sudden wall of paper shielding Nagato's face, and the crackle of burning paper fought the rumble of the collapsing tower. Madara continued pushing forward, one of his hands reaching out. He went straight through Konan as the floor reached a 30-degree angle, his fingers curling into a claw. Nagato stared at the oncoming hand in disbelief. The tip of Madara's fingers brushed the Uzumaki's brow. An enormous orange fist crashed into the masked man's chest and sent him hurtling backwards. He soundlessly slipped through the wall, and was gone from sight. Itaka breathed out. A heartbeat later, Konan struck him with about 4 exploding paper clones. The ethereal ribs surrounding him took the blow, but the pressure wave threw Itaka through the concrete wall behind him and out of the tower with a flat crump. Suddenly, he was much colder. The building kept falling, drawing closer and closer to impact. Itaka watched it go as he let the ribs of the Susanoo fade. Out here, in the darkness of a Megakure's cloudless midnight, it was almost peaceful, certainly more peaceful than waiting in a standoff with Madara. Itaka was falling, but he wasn't worried. Casually, he drew a spool of wire from one of his sleeves. The first move had been made. Now, everything was going to get that much more complicated. The impact was a deafening crash, the roar of rended metal and shattering concrete. The tower landed on its side, splitting in 4 different places and crumbling in on itself. The ground under it jumped, cracks racing along the street in every direction. The third tallest building in the world shattered, Hanzo and Pain's work undone in an instant. Great clouds of dust rolled up, obscuring the wreckage from sight. Nagato Uzumaki wheezed, blood leaking out between his teeth. A cloud of paper caught his armature as it tumbled to the ground, and the whole mass slammed to a stop. The redhead jerked, groaning, and then Konan set him on the ground. The metal met the ruined concrete with a quiet clatter, and a Megakuur's angel floated down beside it, razor-sharp wings protruding from her back. Her head swiveled unnaturally, scanning for the two Uchiha. Nagato himself was still having trouble understanding what had just happened. Itaki had certainly been trying to kill him, the black flames were proof of that. But had Madara been waiting that whole time for Itaki to make his move? The building's collapse itself had been mostly inconsequential. Nagato marveled at that. Konan had saved him, and was impervious to physical damage herself. But of course, Naruto must have known that. Which meant that just like last time, dropping the building had been an orange blur burst out of the cloud of dust, not 15 feet from his face. Nagato rocked back, a jolt of fear shooting up his spine. Naruto Uzumaki was covered in dust, blood, and grime. His jacket was little more than an orange rag, and a multitude of small cuts covered in arms and face. He was carrying a Rasengan in his right hand, and it was tinged red, not from the Kyuubi's chakra, but because some of the blood leaking from Naruto's hand had mixed into it. Every inch of his skin was burned and charred, flaking off in places. His body was coursing with sage chakra, probably the only thing that was keeping him going. And he was angry. So horribly, intensely angry that it physically hurt. Naruto's desire for murder made more blood trickle from Nagato's nose, and he gritted his teeth, watching a violently rotating death approach. Nagato suddenly realized he had failed. No. Konan smashed Naruto to the ground with a paper hammer, and the Jinchuriki was suddenly prone, his Rasengan futilely screeching against the concrete. Nagato's last friend floated forward, her face twisted in a fearsome frown. You won't be dash. That was when the second blur emerged from the dust and kicked Konan's hammer into loose sheets. Nagato's other failure, the boy who had caused this whole catastrophe. Sasuke Uchiha wasn't angry like Naruto was. His face was eerily calm, even. All he was wearing was a pair of grey drawstring pants, and his body was covered with scrapes and bruises, with 2 trails of dried blood prominent beneath his eyes. The hole the Deva path had stabbed in his hand had stopped bleeding, and the Uchiha was still holding his sword, the blade bloodied. But he had a promise in his eyes. And while Naruto's promise was plain for anyone to see, Nagato couldn't help but believe that Sasuke's was more personal. If Naruto didn't rip him apart for what pain had done to his friends, Sasuke would for what he had done to Naruto. This was all a mistake. Sasuke drew his sword back, his arm cocked like a gavel about to descend, and his sword sheathed itself in electricity. He released the throw, and the steel leapt forward like a spinning lightning bolt. More of Konan's paper sped in front of the blade, trying to catch it, and the Chokyuto tore through the attempted defense as if it weren't there. It was set right for Nagato's heart. He watched it come. It seemed that no matter what, whatever was going to kill him was going to be spinning. Konan came out of nowhere, catching the handle mid-spin with her bare hands. She twisted, hurling the sword back at the Uchiha, and he caught it without missing a beat. The lightning faded, and he took a step forward. Naruto was scrambling back to his feet with a snarl. Nagato's friend raised her hand, pointing to the sky. "Begone!" she proclaimed, and what was left of the tower's top exploded. Explosive tags, hundreds and hundreds of explosive tags, attached to the rubble and hidden beneath the ground. They all detonated simultaneously in a wash of heat and pressure, their entire payload directed up and out, away from Nagato. The sound was 1,000 times louder than the building falling, almost as loud as when the Kyuubi had first awoken. Nagato blinked away the flash, staring through the sudden flames. The Rinnegan saw what others could not. Naruto had been sent flying. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, torn away by the monstrous force of Konan's explosives. Nagato was under no illusions that he was gone for good. In Sage mode, Naruto wouldn't be so easy to stop with mere explosives. Physical trauma would be insufficient. Sasuke on the other hand had stood his ground, a skeletal guardian of viciously cold chakra blunting Konan's tags. He was moving forward, disoriented by the force of the blast, but still functioning. Konan hadn't bought much more than time, but right now time was the most valuable commodity Nagato could hope for. Konan swept forward, flanked by half a dozen paper clones. All of their arms transformed, slimming into razor blades and incredibly long needles. Sasuke raised his sword, and the guardian dropped away. He began to cut through them like wheat. Why had he dropped the technique? He must have been getting tired. If Konan could outlast him, perhaps this night could be salvaged. It's not going to work, you know. Nagato blinked as Sasuke cut another Konan down. The real one swept back, peppering the Uchiha with a flurry of explosives, and the ethereal ribs rose again, laughing off the impact. "Excuse me." Nagato croaked. "Your plan." Somehow, Sasuke found times to lock eyes with him, even as he kicked one Konan into pieces and fended off another with a single hand. "It's not going to work." Nagato frowned. "Not another one. What could you possibly know? I know enough." Another dead clone. There were only two left now. Sasuke's voice was as sharp and precise as his sword. "And I know that your plan isn't going to do what you want." The Uchiha smiled. "It doesn't matter if you believe me or not, you'll be dead in a couple minutes anyway. But before you die, you should know." Another clone down. Konan was watching, waiting for an opening. Indulging in a necessary evil to accomplish something greater doesn't lead to peace. He cut the last clone in half with a bloodied hand covered in lightning. "It just creates more people like me." "People like you?" Pain asked. Sasuke stopped, staring at him and Konan. He was probably stalling for Naruto to return. Konan was tense at Nagato's side, ready to begin the offense. Staying back to make sure he wasn't struck down by a quick attack was hampering her. "People in search of vengeance," Sasuke answered. His smile seemed more a grimace, it was just a tightening of the muscles around his jaw, nothing else. "I'm not one of them, anymore," he said softly. "But I was. And I know I'd have scorched the world to cinders in search of my revenge. I could have set a fire that would always burn." Sasuke's eye bled. The Amaterasu came again, and Konan interspersed herself, the voracious fire spreading over the back of her cloak and flaring out around Nagato like a halo. The woman snarled in pain, the fire was burning her even through her paper body. Sasuke charged, and his right eye wept blood. The fire coursed over and around Konan, intent on Nagato. Nagato watched it come in horror as his friend was submerged in the flames. They danced and cackled like devils, feasting on the fireproof paper that comprised Konan's body. It was a vision out of hell. The first drops of rain began to fall, Omegakure's clouds having finally returned, no longer fearing the Kyuubi's rage. They sizzled out of existence meters away from Konan. A fire that would always burn. The words echoed through Nagato's head as he watched his friend combust. They raced to his lips, cracked and bloody, as they formed to speak. He didn't even know what he was going to say. Enough of this. It happened so quickly that Nagato nearly missed it. The black fire around Konan whipped away, flying back towards a different target. Sasuke turned, eyes going wide and his sword coming up. And Madara Uchiha thrust forward with the tanto that had suddenly appeared in his hand, bringing it within an inch of Sasuke's heart. The tanto stopped. Itachi Uchiha was suddenly there, his hand firmly clasped around Madara's arm. The blade trembled, and then Madara dropped it, twisting his shoulder and kicking out. He struck the falling tanto with his heel, sending it rocketing towards Sasuke, and heaved Itachi over his shoulder in the same moment. Sasuke's brother flailed, the thin string wrapped around his hand flashing in the dim light. Sasuke jumped, spinning into a horizontal position, and the tanto shot under him, harmlessly embedding itself in Konan. His sword spun with him, ready to slice Madara from head to toe. The older Uchiha completed his twist and slammed Itachi down on top of Sasuke. The brothers went down in a tangle of limbs and steel, crushed to the dampening pavement. Madara suddenly made a choking sound, and Nagato narrowed his eyes, focusing. There was a wire wrapped around the masked man's throat, the same wire Itachi Uchiha had tied around his hand. The Rinnegan could see in perfect detail how the man's bodysuit gave way under the thin steel. Drops of blood beaded around the indentation on the back of Madara's neck. Then, the wire slipped through, and Itachi and Sasuke collapsed. Madara had become intangible too quickly for Itachi's attempted decapitation to take effect. Both the Uchiha rolled in separate directions, attempting to come to their feet. It was suicide to stay on the ground. Madara pursued Itachi, leveling a brutal kick at the man's back. Nagato watched the whole thing with a painful distance. It was incredibly surreal. A moment ago, he'd been watching Konan burn, watching Sasuke Uchiha kill her, and now that very man was fighting for his life. And Nagato didn't feel anything. He expected a kind of joy, however dull. But there didn't seem to be any point. He was already beaten. The Uzumaki felt it in his bones. In trying to contain the Kyuubi, enact his dream, he'd run down his clock. He'd poured more into pain than he ever had before, and now his life was more in Yahiko than himself. Yahiko, who was lying cold and dead somewhere else in the shattered and melted hellscape that Omegakure had become. All this yelling and rage and fighting, it was all a waste. The main event had already passed. Now, these three and Naruto were just battling over who would have his corpse. Nagato almost wanted to laugh. His head drifted to the left, and his eyes fell on Konan. She was kneeling on the ground, her wings reduced to ash. Their remnants were quickly being washed away by the rain, running in blackened rivulets across the crumbling ground. Her ember eyes were locked on the developing melee, and unlike Nagato's, they were filled with a terrible anger. She was still fighting for him, his last and only friend. She wouldn't lay down her arms until his dream was accomplished, or she was dead. Konan raised her hand, ready to render an angel's judgment. A shadow leapt from the floor and enveloped her, dragging Konan to the ground. Nagato watched in horror as a sickly black tar seeped from the ground, encasing Konan's struggling form. She broke into a swarm of birds, or at least attempted to. The shadow stayed stuck around them, forcing Konan to maintain her shape. She thrashed, unable to escape. None of that, cooed a dripping voice, and Nagato recoiled instinctively in disgust. He recognized that tone. Zetsu. He murmured. The shadow ignored him, constricting around Konan. Beyond them, Madara was still doing his best to kill Sasuke and Itachi. Madara has commanded it. Just watch, the black mass whispered, and Nagato did. Sasuke's blade slipped through Madara's mask, and the man buried his fist in the Uchiha's side. The world immediately began to distort, swirling away, before Itachi's kick drove itself through Madara's suddenly ghostly torso. Sasuke cursed and skidded backwards, keeping his Chokyuto in a defensive posture. Madara's touch was deadly. Sasuke didn't know where he would end up if he were sucked into the swirling void that formed around the man's eye whenever he touched him or his brother, but it could be nowhere good. So far, they'd managed to keep sufficient pressure on the ancient Uchiha, preventing him from utilizing his time-space jutsu, but the defense couldn't last forever. And, Sasuke noted with gritted teeth, they still had no way to harm him. He slipped through every single attack effortlessly. Madara didn't speak. He just turned and went after Itachi. The masked man fought like a machine, his blows mechanical and precise. His fists struck out, and Itachi avoided them, knowing that they could become grasping hands that would suck him out of existence in a moment. Sasuke made eye contact with his brother. They stared at each other for a heartbeat, silently forming a strategy. Sasuke had an inkling of Itachi's plan. His hands started moving into seals almost on their own. One came up to cup his lips, and outroared a gargantuan fireball, twice as tall and 3 times as wide as any of the combatants. Itachi went into a backflip, and Madara glanced back at the jutsu. He didn't move to avoid it, the attack was going to go right through him, like everything else did. But it did delay him for a second, and it did give Itachi just enough time for him to weave 2 seals. Suiden no Jutsu. The torrent of water shot from Itachi's mouth right through the back of Madara's head. The man barely had time to react before the water and the fireball collided. The area was instantly filled with boiling steam, obscuring everything. The only things clear were 3 Sharingan, pinpoints of red and black amongst the gray. Sasuke could see partway through the steam, the Sharingan rendering what was invisible into vague shadows, echoes of reality. But in a battle between high-level shinobi, echoes weren't nearly enough. Itachi's shadow suddenly vanished, the steam rolling undisturbed where he had been. Madara turned, suddenly on the defensive. He didn't advance on Sasuke, instead, they stared at each other for an awkward moment. Madara was remaining intangible, waiting for Itachi to attack. Neither of them could make a move. But as the moment dragged on, it became clear that attack wasn't coming. Madara blinked. Sasuke could see the indecision, however quickly it vanished. Staying intangible drained Madara's chakra, so he couldn't do it forever. But as soon as he attacked, Itachi would strike. Sasuke grinned. Fighting with his brother was much less stressful than fighting against him. Madara finally pressed forward, striding amongst the steam towards Sasuke. The Chokuto came up, but as ever, Madara didn't seem to care. He spoke, sounding almost disappointed. "What happened to you, Sasuke? What happened to the Avenger I had such high hopes for? What happened to wanting your family back? Why are you throwing your revenge away like this?" The youngest Uchiha blinked, his sword dropping for a moment, before he shook his head and brought it up once more. "I saw my family again," Sasuke gritted out, "and they showed me what a fool I was being." Madara blinked. "But Edo Tensei." Itachi's voice echoed through the steam, coming from every direction. Madara's eye narrowed. "Orochimaru," he muttered. "Convenient." He turned back to Sasuke. "What did they tell you? It must have been good, if you and your brother are side by side instead of at each other's throats." The younger Uchiha just responded with a shrug. Tobi sounded disappointed. "Fine then." He paused. "I hope it wasn't about Naruto. He is the most pathetic of you, after all." Sasuke attacked. His initial slice passed right through Madara, but the man didn't take the bait. He was waiting for Sasuke to overextend himself. Sasuke decided to oblige him. He flipped into an axe kick, removing his guard for a moment. Madara just backed up, and kicked out with a roundhouse as Sasuke landed. His foot shot straight for Sasuke's throat, ready to stave in his windpipe. Grimly, Sasuke watched it coming. He was completely open, Itachi had to intervene now. The steam was beginning to fade. His brother chose that moment to make his appearance. Itachi Uchiha emerged from the mist like a specter of death and drove a kunai right into Madara's head before the man had any chance to react. The blade slipped right through. 2 sets of Sharingan widened. Madara hadn't deactivated his intangibility for his attack, it had been a feint. His foot continued swinging around, spinning his body. Madara's palm slapped down, solid once more, on Itachi's chest. "Goddash," he started to say as Sasuke's brother swirled out of existence. Sasuke landed, ready to leap forward and interrupt the process. He could already tell it was going to be too late. Itachi was all but gone. How could Itachi exploded? The mist was dispelled instantly, and Sasuke was tossed backwards, barely keeping his grip on his sword. Chips of concrete buried themselves in his arms, and the detonation had singed his hair, but he was mostly unharmed. Madara had taken the brunt of the blast. A shadow clone. To the Sharingan, it had looked as real as day. Sasuke groaned, rolling forward onto his feet. Finally, he looked back, wondering why no attacks had come from that direction. The paper woman was being drowned by a shadow as Nagato looked on helplessly. Sasuke blinked. He certainly hadn't been expecting that. He looked away as quickly as he'd glanced back. The real threat was still in front of him. Madara was lying flat on his back, stirring. Itachi came striding out of a nearby shadow, finally revealing himself. The masked Uchiha had been torn to ribbons by the clone's detonation, sickly white fluid spilled from his ruined left arm and leg. His right arm was all but destroyed, the shining white of bone clear amongst the torn skin. Madara's right leg was the only part of his body that had seemingly escaped the explosion. His torso was burned down to the ribs in multiple areas, and more of the white fluid, along with no insignificant amount of blood, was leaking from his stomach and gut. His mask was cracked, revealing a hole where the left side of his jaw should have been. Some of his wild black hair was escaping through fragmentations in the front. Itachi stood over him, but Sasuke stayed where he was. He turned so he could keep an eye on both Madara and Pain. Suzuki's brother didn't immediately speak. He stared down at the wrecked man, a kunai falling into his hand. He bent down, placing the blade to Madara's throat. "I suppose it ends here," he murmured, and Madara spat blood. "And I didn't even need to use it. You disappoint me, Madara." Madara wheezed through flash-burned lungs. Suzuki watched incredulously. His brother had just defeated Madara Uchiha. And with a simple exploding clone, of all things. It was ludicrous. Unthinkable. He'd done it in less time than it had taken Naruto to return from his explosive tags-assisted fight, without using his Mangekyo. It was like a dream. "No." Pain called. Almost begged. "Don't." Itachi slit Madara's throat, and the man died with a gurgle. He stared at the body for a moment, and then slowly pushed himself back to his feet, lifting his head to look at Suzuki. The rain intensified, and Pain let out a groan. Suzuki's brother smiled at him. When he spoke, it was in a voice of pure relief. "It's done." Suzuki started to smile back. The shadow strangling Konan laughed. The body at Itachi's feet vanished. Itachi blinked. So did Suzuki. In the time it took their eyes to slide back open, Madara appeared in front of Itachi, whole and unharmed. Impossible, illogical, ludicrous. The brother Uchiha's mind stuttered at the sight. Madara's arm shifted, becoming a gnarl of razor roots. He stabbed forward. Suzuki's mouth opened, a pointless warning rising from his chest. There was an orange flicker around Itachi as his Susanoo began to snap into existence. The roots blunted themselves on the half-formed guardian before breaking through, crashing into Itachi's chest and driving him back. Itachi grunted, off balance, and still in the midst of that frozen, impossible moment, Madara slid forward and buried his foot in Itachi's side. Itachi jumped away, pushed by the attack, and barely in time. Mokuton razors replaced Madara's foot. The roots expanded inside Itachi's body, ripping out another couple inches and cutting him deeply, before his dodge carried him away, leaving him with a horrendous wound instead of a fatal one. Blood poured down his torso from the hole in his side, soaking his cloak, and Itachi coughed up a welter of deep red. Madara viciously withdrew his foot, wet with blood, and Itachi collapsed, grasping at the wound. "Iza-" he started to say in a distant tone, and then he fell over. Suzuki charged, a scream of rage on his lips. Madara turned to face him, and an enormous shuriken leapt from his glaring eye. There was a spark of lightning, and Suzuki cut the projectile in half with his bare hand, his blitz not slowing at all. The Chidori remained in his hand, sparking angrily and screeching louder than its namesake. "You thought it would be that easy?" Madara hissed, stepping right through Suzuki's Chidori, and then Suzuki himself. Suzuki spun back, sword first, trying to disembowel the man, but the sword slid right through his chest. As soon as it cleared and Madara began to move again, Suzuki's eye spat a burst of Amaterasu. The black flames moved through Madara as well. He seized Suzuki by the throat, lifting him into the air. "Pathetic." The both of Deshi growled. Suzuki's right eye bled, and the Amaterasu that had missed Madara suddenly made a sharp turn and splashed against the man's back. Madara howled, throwing Suzuki to the floor and swirling out of existence. He returned before Suzuki was even fully to his feet, his cloak was gone, and the Amaterasu with it. Madara kicked out, and Suzuki caught the blow, only for Madara to slip through his hands a second later. This was hopeless, fighting the man alone was impossible. But Itachi. Suzuki surged to his feet with a lateral swipe, but this time, Madara didn't let the strike simply pass through him. He clapped his hands together, seizing the sword mid-swing. Suzuki began channeling lightning into the blade. "Enough," Madara declared. He twisted his arms in a full-body motion, and Suzuki's Chokuto snapped clean in half. Suzuki watched most of his sword twirl away in astonishment. When Madara's hand shot out and seized the whirling shard of steel, Suzuki knew he wasn't going to be fast enough to get out of the way. He was already too fatigued, while Madara was mostly fresh. He just didn't have the edge in speed anymore. The ancient Uchiha drove the top half of Suzuki's sword towards his chest, and with the Sharingan's perfect perception, Suzuki had plenty of time to think about it. He realized in an instant that he had two options. The first option was dying. It wasn't exactly appealing. He decided on the second instead. His arm shot up, and Madara drove the broken sword half right through it and into his chest, impaling his forearm. Sasuke choked, falling backwards with an inch of steel scraping past his ribs and pinning his left arm to his torso, and Madara leveled him with a brutal kick to the shoulder. Sasuke lost his grip on the remnants of his sword. The younger Uchiha spun to the rain-soaked ground with a grunt and lay there, twitching in agony. His sword clattered to his side a moment later. Madara took a step forward, stomping down on Sasuke's pinned arm. He yelped, trying to roll away from the attack, and Madara stalked after him, his visible eye gleaming in satisfaction. Finally, he muttered, kicking out at Sasuke again and earning another growl of pain. Now, all that's left is dash. Naruto hit Madara like an orange missile. He led with a Rasengan, and the whirling blue sphere drove a bloody divot in Madara's back as the Jinchuriki bore him to the ground. Sasuke blinked. His friend had finally returned from his explosives-assisted flight. Madara went intangible almost immediately, and Naruto passed through him, leaving a horrific bloody spiral imprinted in the man's back. It almost looked like the symbol printed on the back of a leaf flak jacket. The Rasengan struck the ground, throwing up an explosion of ruined concrete and splattered water. Madara regained his solidity, reaching out for Naruto's foot. Sasuke scrabbled for his broken sword. His Susanoo sparked around him, unable to rise. Sealing the Kyuubi had finally caught up with him. Madara's hand latched around Naruto's ankle, his eye began emitting a distinctive rupture in space. That was when the Kage Bunshin Naruto had launched himself with caught up and kicked Madara in the back of the head. The Uchiha sailed away, losing his grip on Naruto. Mid-flight, he swirled out of existence. Naruto snarled at the empty space, sounding like nothing more than a wild animal. He jerked his head towards Sasuke, then Itachi, and finally Nagato and Konan. His face twisted in confusion at the shadow constricting the paper woman, before he shook his head. The pigmentation around his eyes had vanished, and his pupils had returned to normal. His sage mode had run out. By all rights, he shouldn't even have been standing. Blood was running from his nose and mouth, and flaps of burned skin were still dangling from his forehead and cheeks. Instead of collapsing like he should have, Naruto withdrew a kunai from his thigh and hurled it at Nagato's face. The redhead glared the projectile down, before Madara appeared in a twist of reality and caught it between two fingers. None of that, he growled. Naruto took a step forward, bloody teeth bared, and Madara vanished once more. Sasuke watched from the ground, more blood running freely down his chest. His fingers brushed the hilt of his shattered sword. Somewhere off to his left, Sasuke's brother groaned. A fire lit in Itachi's hand, and he brought it down towards the gaping hole in his side. The smell of sizzling flesh filled the air, quickly drowned out by the now pounding rain. The smell, and the sound, made it so that the next time Madara appeared, Sasuke almost noticed him too late. The masked man appeared amongst the pouring rain, just behind Naruto, his kunai raised. Naruto! Sasuke's warning fought the thunderous rain, barely winning, and Naruto spun with his arm raised, catching Madara's wrist. The Jinchuriki kicked out and knocked the masked man back a step or two, but Madara didn't retaliate. Instead, he tossed the kunai backwards. Not at Sasuke, or Itachi. Rather, the knife struck the flat edge of Sasuke's sword. The steel leapt into the air, twirling sideways through the rain towards Madara as Naruto took another step forward. There was a kunai in his left hand, and his right was raised for a haymaker. Sasuke watched what was left of his Chokyuto fly away, his whole frame trembling in rage, and his left eye bled. Itachi, who mostly had finished cauterizing his side, let out a long, deep sigh. It almost sounded like now. Tobi caught the whirling blade without a hitch, spun, and drove it through Naruto's side, just below the ribs. The blonde fell back with a gasp, his kunai clattering from spasming fingers. He reached down towards the sword, snarling, before the masked man ripped it out his side. Naruto howled, falling to his knee as blood poured down his stomach. A second later, Tobi kicked him in the face. It was only after Naruto smashed to the ground, spreading yet more blood across the concrete, that Tobi noticed his right arm was covered in black flames. Sasuke's desperate Amaterasu had covered the hilt of his sword in the potent fire, and it had promptly begun to spread up the Uchiha's arm. The masked man barely reacted, his left hand straightened out, forming a crude scalpel, and he cut his arm off in a single vicious motion. It splashed to the ground, vaporizing the water around it and spraying pale white blood. Tobi stared at his lost arm, then down at Naruto. The blonde was retching blood, clutching his side as blood poured out between his fingers. The masked man flexed his remaining hand. "Worth it," he rumbled. He turned around and found himself staring into a Sharingan. It wasn't Itachi or Sasuke's. The both of them were still on the ground. Itachi was slowly bleeding to death, his hands clasped over his chest in a strangely peaceful position, while Sasuke was struggling to one knee, more and more of his life pouring from him with every movement. It was just a single eye, containing a crimson circle with 4 harshly pointed growths. The pattern was spinning, rotating so rapidly the 4 points were beginning to look like one. And its owner. A crow. Sleek and black, hanging in the air, and glaring at Tobi with its single almost oversized eye. The bird spoke. It spoke in Itachi Uchiha's voice. Koto dash. Tobi's own Sharingan went wide. He tried to activate the Kamui. Too slow. Amatsukami. The Koto Amatsukami, long ago gifted by Shisui Uchiha in a time of utter desperation, was cast in an instant. One of the most powerful genjutsu in the world, beamed directly into the masked Uchiha's eye, and carrying with it a single implacable order. Defend Konoha. It struck, and Tobi reeled back. Shisui's chakra weeded in through his eye, racing down his optic nerves, intent on his brain. It moved as fast as thought, for a shinobi of the older Uchiha's caliber, that was very fast indeed. But here, it was a bit different. The chakra coating the nerves, speeding their signals along and ensuring that they reached their destination faster than any electrical impulse had a right to, was Tobi's chakra. The chakra moving along them was Shisui's. It crept through them like salmon up a stream, fast, but not quite as fast as it could be. The opposing chakra fought it, slowing its progress. Which was why Tobi had just enough time, 0.005 of a second or so, to very deliberately raise his left hand, extend 2 fingers, and drive them up to the knuckle into his own temple. His mask shattered around the offending appendages, revealing more of his tousled black hair and the top of a series of concentric rings, ridges pressed in the skin of his face. The chakra stopped. So did all signals to end from Tobi's right eye. The world went pitch black. All Tobi had left was the sound of a Megakure's rain, pouring down around him. He waited in the dark. Waited to see if he was still himself. The crow vanished in a swirl of feathers, winging away. Tobi stood for a moment, blood pouring from his temple and coating his hand. Sasuke finally made it to a single knee. Naruto groggily raised his head, not understanding what had just happened. He stared at the older Uchiha, the pain in his side turning everything red and black. The masked man laughed. "You blinked, Itachi," he chuckled. Naruto couldn't see Itachi's face, but the man stiffened a little at the words. Tobi laughed again. It was the kind of sound that made Naruto think of a room full of corpses. "Now," he said, still giggling slightly. It was relief, Naruto realized. That was laughter brought by relief. "To kill the lot of you." He turned towards Naruto, staring at him with an unseeing eye. "Except for you, of course, Naruto. You finally get to accomplish your dream." "Like hell," Sasuke groaned. Tobi turned back to him. "You'll be first," he said, striding forward. He didn't walk like a blind man. Naruto's vision flashed red. This time, it wasn't in pain. He pulled himself up more, hissing as the hole in his side sent pulses of cold fire screaming across his torso. Like hell this bastard was going to take Sasuke from him, along with everyone else. "I'm sorry." Like hell. Somehow, he got one foot under the other. "Madara." Nagato's voice stopped Tobi in his tracks, and both he and Naruto turned to look at the redhead. The man looked absolutely terrible. Soaked to the bone, his ribs clear against his pale skin, and his eyes narrowed, the Rinnegan hardly shining out. He looked the image of death. The Rinnegan darted to Konan, still struggling beneath Black Zetsu's shadow. "Release her." Tobi didn't look at Konan. His newly acquired blindness made doing so pointless. Instead, he just tilted his head up. "I can't," he said flatly. Nagato stirred, blinking heavily. He looked as though he were on the edge of a very deep sleep. Naruto watched him with hate-filled eyes, willing him to drop dead. "Don't let yourself be eaten by your grief." "I'm sorry." Naruto shook his head. Nagato finally spoke again, his husk of a voice nearly masked by the rain. "Why?" He sounded broken. Toby didn't get a chance to respond. Itachi, his voice little more than a whisper slicing through the rain, cut him off. "You are a pawn," Sasuke's brother said. Nagato looked at him, even the tiny motion carrying with it endless exhaustion. Toby didn't turn, he just stood there, Itachi's words slipping past him, and he did nothing to deny them. Nagato frowned, his pale forehead crinkling. "What? You are a pawn?" Itachi whispered. "And now, he seeks to remove you and Konan from the board." Nagato looked with a dry, painful wheeze from one Uchiha to the other. "Is this true?" Toby stared back at him, his Sharingan slowly swirling. Naruto stared at both the Akatsuki's leaders, one a fraud, and the other hidden behind a mask. "Of course," the masked man finally said, and Nagato's eyes dimmed. "You were my pawn in bringing about true peace to this world." Nagato frowned. "That? He wants peace just as you do, Nagato," Itachi said. Naruto, almost against his own will, found himself paying attention to the Uchiha's steady rasp. How could Madara of all people be fighting for peace? But he has a different solution. "Yes," Toby said. "The infinite Tsukuyomi, a perfect world, laid over this one. No more war, no more death." He took a step forward, everyone else instantly went on guard. "No more lost loved ones, no more pain. Everything in it would be perfect." Naruto started. A perfect world. The pain in his side started to seep away as something unidentifiable filled his chest. "How was that possible? Then why didn't you tell me about it?" Nagato asked. His eye shifted to Konan, still constrained by Black Zetsu, and he pursed his cracked lips, a smoldering anger building behind the Rinnegan's rings. "You know we would have helped you. Such a perfect world, if it did work, would be a certain peace. A definite answer. Why didn't you tell me?" "You had to die for it to exist," Toby said languidly. "You would never see it." Naruto stiffened. "And that matters." Nagato croaked, one of his bone-like hands curling into a fist. His knuckles grew even whiter, protruding like knobs from his stretched thin flesh. "I would gladly have given my life for such a thing. It would be a dream." Itachi cut in, and Toby finally turned to him, raising a hand in warning. Itachi "An illusion, cast upon the world." Sasuke's brother delivered the whispered proclamation once more, like a hammer upon a stubborn nail, and Nagato snapped his gaze to him. "An illusion." Nagato looked back to Toby. "You want to put everyone in a perfect illusion." "Of course," Toby affirmed. "Others bring strife. Pain. Alone in a perfect world, there is nothing that can harm you. Everyone would live forever in a blissful existence. There would never be death, not for their bodies or in the dream. An eternal paradise." Nagato stared at the masked man in confusion. "But, that's not peace. People can't just live in a dream. It's not what they'd." Toby blinked. "Want?" Nagato nodded uncertainly, and Toby laughed. "Do you think they want to be burned, blasted apart, reduced to cinders?" He leveled his stump at Nagato. "That is the consequence of your plan, Nagato." The redhead shook. "But it is their own choice. I am simply giving them the tools to reach peace themselves, through their own trials." He finally raised his voice, his lips cracking. "An illusion? You would take away that choice." Toby marched up to Nagato, bringing his face not a meter away from the redheads. Behind him, Naruto was reeling. He had no idea what to think of any of this. Instead, he was entirely focused on getting back to his feet. Sasuke, a couple feet over his shoulder, was doing the same. "What do choices matter?" Toby hissed. What would what they want matter? He drew his forearm-less arm once more, pointing at Nagato's eyes. People want lots of things. Some are good, and some are bad. Some people want power, and some people want peace. Some people want to be alone, and some people want to be surrounded by others. He glared back at Naruto with a single spinning eye, seeing nothing. Some people want to be friends. He shifted the Sharingan to Sasuke, who'd finally gotten his other foot under him, and some people want to be avengers. He looked back to Nagato, gifting him with the same mad look, and a Megakure's god curled his lip in disgust. But a world like ours robs them of that, Toby said coldly. No matter what, someone, somewhere will be unhappy. In the end, everyone is doomed to a futile life, since dreams will only carry you so far before reality reasserts itself, and you're forced to wake up. He chuckled. Forced to face the fact that your friends are gone, consumed by a crusade they, or you, didn't fully understand, that your blindly misguided revenge has devoured half your life, and that peace is impossible. Naruto flinched, baring his teeth, and finally found his feet. He and Sasuke slowly stood, both in agony, but unable to bear staying on the ground. Toby continued. If I am offering people a chance to remain in that dream of theirs forever, what does it matter if they say they don't want it? He spat in Nagato's face. Then, he took a deep breath, backing up a pace. I know what people like you truly want. And it isn't reality. So if they won't save themselves, I'll do the job for them. The arrogance made Naruto grind his teeth. He couldn't understand how someone could believe they could choose the fate of the rest of the world, deciding to trample on everyone who got in their way. Who? You're right. Those little people and their little dreams, why should I care about them? I have my own dream. Zabuza Momokai spoke from beyond the gulf of 3 years' time. That was, old. Stranger yet, that. The missing nin's words, so hopeful at the time, gained a sinister cast as Toby's rang over them. Naruto blinked. What was this? This was the man who had killed his parents. Good as killed them, at least. Who'd been responsible for Gaara's death, who'd played pain like a divine puppet. He was responsible for the Akatsuki. Even for the horrible loneliness Naruto had been prey to his whole life. And here he was, standing right in front of him, telling him that he'd done it all these horrible, unforgivable things, to save him. Save everyone. Naruto wanted him dead. It was a physical compulsion, as sure as gravity. He was drawn forward, his mind full of visions of Toby with his eyes gouged out, his throat crushed, his chest pulped. Of him begging to die. And yet. Let me show you my pain. Nagato. Team Guy and Hinata and Shino and Sakura and Shikamaru and Sai and Ino were dead because he wanted to save the rest of the world. Jiraiya had almost been in the same category. Was this a genjutsu? It almost felt like one. But, not quite. Naruto felt trapped in his own skull. It could have been the internal damage. Perhaps the drum playing Hinata's words, I'm sorry, over and over in his head had finally broken something. There was a distance. Inside himself. Maybe he was passing out. Naruto could barely make sense of what was going through his own mind. It was all jumbled, like a stack of scrolls haphazardly piled on a desk, and he was just racing through them, tearing the fragile paper in his haste, tossing them around, desperately searching for something he could feel just beyond. Hurting some to save others. It made sense, in a sick way. Naruto wasn't good at math, but it made sense to him. If 3 people died so 10 people could live, that would be 7 more people alive than would be dead if no one had been sacrificed at all. And that was exactly what Nagato and Madara were doing. And it felt wrong. Was he being an idiot? Or was it just because they always demanded he be the one to sacrifice so that others could live? Was that selfish? If he gave up his friends and his life, the world could be saved. But no. Naruto blinked for the 3rd time. That was the thing. It wasn't saving the world. Nagato didn't want to save the world. He wanted to scare it so bad that it would never resort to war again. Wanted it to know there would always be a hammer hanging over its head, ready to smash it if it acted self-destructively. If it made more orphans. And when Nagato was gone. Eventually, even those who have witnessed this weapon will fall back into old ways of thinking. Ancient hatred will be rekindled, and humanity will go to war once more. But this time, I will not be there, I will not need to be. The shinobi of the world will use the weapon themselves, and with that they will inflict such a lasting pain that peace will reign, however temporary, for many years after. Justice, for the crimes of all, will have been done in mere moments, and whoever would be left would be clean of past sin. He believed that when the Byakuya weapon was inevitably reused, another cycle of peace would begin. That such a resurgence of destruction, again and again, would maintain over the years, reducing suffering. Naruto smiled in a horribly broken way. He finally saw his problem with Nagato's plan. Not the problem he had with dying so thousands of others could be murdered. The problem that had niggled at him, even as he'd discussed it with Jiraiya. It had taken talking to Nagato, in the crazy bastard's his own village, and him promising to succeeding in murdering Naruto's friends for him to see it. The central conceit of your fantasy is that you believe people want to change. Nagato had said that. But Nagato thought people could change. He deeply believed it. He'd thought Naruto would understand him if he experienced pain, and he had hoped Naruto would agree with him. He thought pain could teach any lesson, construct any bridge. That with a shared connection like pain, people could move on. He believed in humanity. Naruto nearly burst out laughing at the irony. Nagato truly thought that the world didn't want to die. That it would recognize the path it was on. That when 10,000 dead became 20,000, and then 30, 40, 50, 100, the weapon would stop being deployed. The shinobi of the elemental nations would finally realize their mistake. Naruto wanted to believe that too. But then there was Madara. Madara, who had murdered Naruto's parents, built the Akatsuki, enabled Nagato's dream. Madara, who wasn't so different from Zabuza Mamakai, who'd stood on that blood-stained bridge all those years ago and declared his dream more important than anyone else's. Zabuza Mamakai, who wasn't that different from Naruto himself. I'll be the next Hokage. How many people dreamed of being Hokage? How many dreams was Naruto putting below his own when he said that? It was the same thing. The exact same thing. The only difference was the scale, and the intent. Maybe this was what his father had been talking about, masked by all the hurt and rage. There was always someone else who believed their dream more important than the last. And there was always someone who dreamed of saving the world. And their dream destroyed the dream of the one who came before them. We both want the same thing, right? Naruto, Madara, and Nagato. They were all asking the same question. They'd just found different answers. Except that Naruto had lost his, Nagato's wouldn't work, and Madara's. Madara's would work, but it would throw away everything. It would never give anyone a chance to seek real peace, and trap in a pristine fake universe. Nagato thought people could change, so he would level the world and help them start anew. Madara didn't think people could change, he thought that he was the only one who recognized their mistakes, and so he believed tossing away the key to the world was the only option. If they wouldn't save themselves by embracing his plan, they would be imprisoned for their own good. Was it better for people to die searching for the answer to themselves, or for them to be kept safe? To Naruto, the answer seemed obvious. But he realized, for the first time that night, how someone could latch onto the other end of the question. For nearly 10 seconds, there was nothing but the rain. Naruto silently struggled with himself, and Tobi stared expectantly at Nagato. "You fool," Nagato finally whispered. Tobi rocked back. Nagato's voice was quiet and rasping, but it pierced through the rain like a dagger. "Don't insult me, Madara." The Rinnegan shone like a sun in the dark. "Do not insult me with your nihilistic idiocy." He reared up in his armature, and despite his protruding ribs, despite the blood running across his lips, and despite his matted, dulled hair, Nagato had never looked more a Megakure's god. "I want to fix the world," he thundered, the voice emerging from him surely far too loud for such a frail frame. "You just want to run away from it." Nagato bared his teeth. "But I am no child, and I don't plan on fleeing to a dream. I will accomplish my goal, the Akatsuki's goal, or I will die trying. He spat blood across Tobi's mask. The masked man stared straight ahead. He grinded his teeth so hard that one of them audibly cracked right down the middle, and Naruto twitched. He muttered, unable to wipe away the blood marring his mask, am surrounded by idiots. He turned to the shadow strangling Konan. Zetsu. Take the Rinnegan. He tilted his head back towards Naruto and Sasuke, who both stood haggardly, their clothes stained with blood and rain. I'll finish this. Naruto's vision was narrowing down into a red and black tunnel, his injuries and exhaustion were finally starting to bring him down. But still, in his head. I'm sorry. The drum was still there. He wasn't going to lie down. Not until that voice was silent. He slumped forward, his expression flat, his hands clutching the hole in his side. Sasuke, he wheezed, blood dripping from his mouth. The Uchiha's eyes twitched towards him, and Naruto looked back with a fierce grin. He's blind, and he's got one arm. His vision shook just a little, before he pushed back the distortion by force of will. Think we can take him? Sasuke stared at him, then at Tobi, standing there with blood marring his cracked mask, his right arm missing above the elbow, and his remaining hand buried in his own temple. Then, he stared down at himself. Both of the younger Uchiha's hands had holes through them, and blood ran freely down his palms, as well as his torso. The rain washed it into a dull brown. His chest wound made his breaths produce an uncomfortable sucking sound, and his eyes were narrowed in exhaustion. The Mangekyo had vanished, Sasuke had returned to the ordinary Sharingan, unable to keep up with his eyes' chakra drain. And his sword was broken. Naruto's friend looked back up at him. Just don't bleed out, he muttered. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Naruto grinned. You got it, he rasped. He couldn't die now. Not just when he was starting to understand. The first thing that happened was Black Zetsu catching on fire as he squirmed up towards Nagato. The Amaterasu hadn't been meant for him, but the Rinnegan, Zetsu had interspersed himself, sparing the dojutsu. The shadow screeched, splitting apart and bolting into the deeper darkness of a Megakure. Itachi Uchiha fell back, letting out a sound like a death rattle. He flirted with unconsciousness for a moment, before deciding he would be better served staying awake. The second was Tobi stepping forward as Naruto and Sasuke broke into a pained run right at him. Kmen, the blind man hissed. He didn't waste any time. As soon as the sound of Naruto's footsteps was close enough, he leapt into a flying kick. The blonde ducked, and the foot sailed right over his head, only for Tobi's following knee to crash into his cheek and hurl him to the ground. Naruto clumsily rolled, coming back to his feet with a pained grunt and more blood gushed from the hole in his side. That side of his pants was completely red, despite the rain. He was beginning to feel lightheaded. Sasuke came in from behind, a vicious punch aimed at Tobi's kidney. The masked man turned, sweeping low, and kicked Sasuke's feet out from under him. As Sasuke fell, Naruto charged in from the side and levered Tobi with his shoulder. Instead of passing through the man as he expected to, the body check sent Tobi sailing away. He hit the ground and tumbled with a growl, and Naruto blinked. He'd hit him. The revelation struck Naruto like one of the distant bolts of lightning echoing through the village. Sasuke! He shouted. He can't use his jutsu. Sasuke didn't respond. He just nodded and moved in like a predator, head low and hands like knives. He went after the man just as he rolled to his feet. For a brief moment, Tobi held his own. He deflected two of Sasuke's strikes, and responded with a strike to the younger Uchiha's solar plexus. But Sasuke didn't fall back, he took the strike head-on, spitting blood as one of his ribs fractured, and responded with a brutal straight kick to the masked man's gut. Tobi fell back silently, and Naruto stumbled to Sasuke's side. Listen, he gasped. I got an idea. Sasuke looked at him incredulously. You. Naruto coughed up a dollop of blood. Just keep him occupied for a sec. Sasuke didn't question it. He just nodded, and charged back in, ignoring the pain in his chest and hands. Behind him, Naruto put his hands together, focusing the last of his reserves. This was going to hurt. Tobi snarled, and Sasuke went into a roundhouse kick, putting himself between the man and Naruto. For just a second, the blonde was obscured. The masked man didn't care, he couldn't see anyway. Distantly, he heard a puff of smoke. Sasuke's kick that was a bit too high. His foot went just over Tobi's head, and the older Uchiha grinned under his cracked mask. Bits were beginning to flake off, revealing more of his cheek and mouth. He jumped back and kicked high, aiming for Sasuke's chest, ready to knock him out of the air and shatter his ribcage for good. Sasuke grinned. A kunai flashed by his side, and Tobi leaned just slightly to the side as his foot soared upwards. The knife schemed along the upper sleeve of his bodysuit, cutting a thin line in it. Droplets of rain fell like blood, and a peculiar light gleamed off the knife. Sasuke realized it was the glow of his own reflected Sharingan. Of course, Sasuke's Sharingan saw something else as well. "Ah," Tobi said. His foot made impact with Sasuke's chest, and the Uchiha crashed down, cracking the concrete under him and eliciting a gasp of pain. Tobi raised his foot, ready to crush Sasuke's chest or throat, whichever he could. The kunai exploded in a flash of smoke. Naruto emerged, his chakra nearly exhausted by the simple trick. He spun in the air, maintaining the kunai's momentum, and brought a screaming Rasengan down in a crushing arc towards Tobi's back. Which was when the hand buried in Tobi's temple warped, roots and bark whirling from it, and wrapped around Naruto's throat, bringing him to a crashing halt. Tobi's fingers remained stuck in his own temple, but his left arm had split at the elbow. The world started to narrow down, and Sasuke cursed. That had been the last shot. "Udesh," the masked man started to say, deadly satisfaction leaking off his voice. Naruto exploded into smoke, and the roots were suddenly strangling nothing. The Rasengan in his hand went in a puff of smoke as well, and the real Naruto Uzumaki emerged from it, foot cocked back. Sasuke would have laughed if he didn't feel incredibly hollow. A henge within a henge, and disguised as a jutsu to hide the chakra signature from the Sharingan. Begrudgingly, he couldn't help but call it clever. He saw, in extremely gratifying detail, every facet of Tobi's face stretch in horror and anger. The world was a tunnel for him now, quickly swirling down the drain. All that was clear was the Uchiha's face, and Naruto's foot. The kick connected. The remnants of Tobi's mask exploded, reduced to dust by the force of the hit. Naruto screamed, every ounce of the last few hours pouring out of him and into his strike. Tobi's head snapped back, his sodden black hair waving in the air. Blood crawled, dreamlike slow, from his mouth. The tooth he'd previously cracked in his rage went with it. There was a ripple in the air, exploding away from the man's face, and it carried the blood and rain with it. He hit the ground like a sack of bricks. The hand he had buried in his head came free, slamming into the concrete hard enough to crack it. Sasuke's Sharingan deactivated. Naruto crashed to the ground with a groan. They both lay there for what seemed like an hour, staring up at the rain and blinking as it struck their eyes. Then, Tobi started screaming. His fingers had moved away from his optic nerves. The hostile chakra attack he had inserted was no longer being obstructed. Neither was Tobi's vision, but at the moment, he didn't seem to care. "Oh God," it started. Just a mutter. He rolled over, staring at Naruto with a single horrified eye. The other was closed. His face was young, unfamiliar, he certainly wasn't Madara Uchiha. Rings, almost like the Rinnegan, were pressed into his skin around his open eye. "Oh God." He looked away, up at the sky. "Oh God." He reached up with his hand, covered in his own blood in a smudge of gray matter, into the rain. "Kakashi!" he shouted. Naruto and Sasuke stared, barely able to move. "Kakashi! I'm sorry. I'm Dash." A shadow flowed over him. Black Zetsu had returned, though had been lessened by attack as Amaterasu. "Madara," he hissed. "Madara! More are coming. Ignore the others. You need to retrieve the Rinnegan now." Tobi twisted his head with a furious grin. "I am not Madara," he shouted in the shadow's face, and the thing recoiled. "Not that hateful thing. I'm Obito. I am Obito Uchiha, of the Leaf." The shadow blinked. "No." It said it again, deeper, more hatefully. "No. You are Madara. You've just forgotten." Naruto reached out with a trembling hand, and the shadow slapped it away. It flowed over Obito, covering him in itself. The man shouted, and the shadow poured itself down his mouth, his nose. It seeped into his tear ducts, masked his ears. Don't worry. I'll help you remember. Then, Obito stood up with shaky legs, stumbling towards Nagato like some sort of twisted marionette. Naruto crawled after the shadow-infested man. Sasuke stayed flat on his back, breathing shallowly. Itachi was so still it was impossible to tell if he were unconscious or dead. Obito shuffled past Konan. The woman was lying unconscious on the ground, her lack of oxygen having finally felled her. The shadow's puppet jerked, his remaining arm twitching at his side. His head was lolling back and forth, unable to settle on. More white fluid was leaking from his truncated arm. Nagato, Obito said, his voice echoing, alien, and completely inhuman. Thusais Nagato. I need Thusais. He reached the redhead, and Nagato reared back in horror as shadows leaked from Obito's mouth and eyes. A shaking hand reached out, writhing with darkness and stained with blood. Wanti hurt a bit. Obito's hand settled around Nagato's left eye, cupping it almost tenderly. Zetsu dash! Nagato shouted, and then the shadow tore out his eye. A Megakure's god screamed, hands coming up to cup his face. They withdrew from the armature with a thick sucking sound. Nagato tried to snatch at Obito's withdrawing hand, but the shadow was too fast, even slowed by Obito as it was. The Rinnegan was out of reach. Ah! The thing's voice had stabilized. Now for the other. The shadow reached in for the second Rinnegan, and Nagato flinched back, baring his teeth. Naruto felt like he should have felt some joy at the sight. Instead, there was only disgust. Then, the shadow cocked its head. Naruto looked around, distantly confused. There was something filling the air, competing with the rain. A faint sound. Naruto looked back to Sasuke, just to be sure, but his friend was still lying on his back, breathing shallowly. He could swear that he was hearing 1,000 chirping birds. What dash? Kakashi Hatake burst out of the rain and darkness, his hand cloaked in lightning. The shadow turned Obito's body towards the sound, its sick yellow eye widening. It brought up its lone hand on reflex, before immediately withdrawing it in its precious cargo. Instead of trying to deflect Kakashi's attack, it just leapt 30 feet straight up. Kakashi blazed by beneath the shadow and its puppet, just in time for a volley of white needles to pierce through the rain and bury themselves across Obito's body. The Uchiha started bleeding profusely, but the shadow driving him didn't care. Its entire concern was on avoiding the gargantuan Raiznon just a couple inches from its face. Obito went intangible, and the shadow along with him. Zetsu had finally figured out how to command his Sharingan. The Raiznon passed through, and the shadow caught a glimpse of who was carrying it. Jiraiya of the Sun-In looked rather extraordinarily angry. So did the toads attached to his shoulders. The shadow passed through him as well, reaching back with a clenched hand. Its knuckles settled on Jiraiya's back. Perhaps. Shan-Naro. An impossible force struck Obito from above, and suddenly he and the shadow were plummeting towards the ground at something far more than terminal velocity. Black Zetsu blinked. Most of Obito's ribs were paste, along with several of his vertebrae. His remaining arm was suddenly dislocated. Unbeknownst to the shadow, something else had been pulped by the punch. It wouldn't realize this till nearly a minute later. As it was, two options were presented to it. Stay here, and die retrieving the second Rinnegan. Or, time to leave, it whispered to Obito. The man screamed inside his own head. Obito and Zetsu struck the ground in an explosion of concrete and water, about 10 feet from Nagato. Sakura Haruno landed a moment later, panting in rage. But when the water and debris cleared, the shadow and its puppet had vanished. Sakura growled in frustration, and Kakashi came to her side, his rakery fading. He stared down at the crater Obito's impact had left. Gone. It wasn't a question, but Sakura nodded anyway. I got him, though, she muttered. He probably won't get far. She turned, and her eyes finally fell on Naruto. The blonde was staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Sakura herself went pale when she saw how much blood was staining her friend's jacket and pants. Sakura! Naruto whispered. Behind him, Sasuke twisted just a bit at the name. Sakura took in both their injuries and bit her lip. Geez, she said, striding forward and fighting her tears. Green chakra started pulsing around her hands. Hold still, you idiots. She bent over Naruto, and he smiled up at her in relief. The voice in his head grew just a bit quieter. This is probably going to sting. Jiraiya huffed, turning towards Nagato with inhuman eyes. His one-time pupil stared back, his breathing unsteady. Without a word, the Sannin started walking forward, his lone hand curling into a fist. Wait. The wheeze stopped him in his tracks, and Jiraiya turned, confusion flashing across his face. Naruto stared up at his master as Sakura's chakra played over him, stopping his bleeding. He struggled up onto an elbow, ignoring his teammates' protest. He's mine. The Sannin watched his student with empty eyes. That's not your job, Naruto, he sighed, shaking his head. He glanced over his shoulder. He's my student. My responsibility. He turned, looking away from Naruto. I'll finish this. But dash. Naruto shouted, hacking up blood. Jiraiya didn't look back. He's hurt you too much, Naruto, the Sannin ground out. You can't do this. Not now. He lowered his head. You won't come back. Naruto shut up. One of the voices in his head briefly triumphed over the others. Don't become just another man looking for revenge. Jiraiya let out another sigh, an exhausted, pathetic sound, and continued approaching Nagato. The rain pounded down, lending a rapid staccato to accompany the man's heavy footsteps. Sensei. This time, when Jiraiya stopped, he didn't look tired, or broken. This time, he looked enraged. Don't, he said through clenched teeth. Don't, Nagato. The time for that is long past. The toads on his shoulders stared at the man who had been pain with fierce, unforgiving eyes. This is over. You've lost. He started shaking. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. Kakashi watched the confrontation with a pitiless, glaring Sharingan, his face expressionless. Sakura was focused on keeping Sasuke conscious. She looked to the Uchiha's brother, her eyes worried. Itachi's injuries were severe. Nagato didn't look Jiraiya in the face. He stared at the ground, unable to meet his former master's eyes. I know, he rasped out. Jiraiya twitched. Then dash. I've failed. Nagato finally met Jiraiya's eyes. He was tired. So tired. The Akatsuki is finished. He frowned, the last spark of resistance in his frame surging. But I'll be damned if my dream is finished with it. The Rinnegan filled Jiraiya's vision, and he started, unable to tear his gaze from Omegakure's broken god. Let me talk to him, sensei, Nagato hissed, more blood leaking from the corner of his lip. Let me talk to Naruto Uzumaki. Before I die, there's something I must say. Not Sick Chapter 28. The end of the beginning. Naruto walked on unsteady feet to face the man who had broken him. Kakashi followed after, ready to catch him if he fell. Sakura was behind the both of them, tending to Sasuke and Itachi Uchiha. Itachi had come far too close to bleeding out, so Sakura focused on him while Sasuke stirred, barely conscious. He was only distantly aware of what was going on around him. All that mattered was that reinforcements had arrived, and he, Naruto, and Itachi were not dead. Nagato waited for him, eyes filled with exhaustion and resolve. Naruto, he finally said, his rasping voice barely carrying through the rain. The blonde stared hatefully at him, his hands clenching and unclenching. I must apologize. Naruto's gaze shifted to incredulous, and then back to baleful. A cold fire relit in his gut, racing along his nerves and dousing his brain in mercury. The rain faded. He could only hear one thing. I'm sorry. You're sorry. He growled. Kakashi looked like a statue at Naruto's arm, a statue that could burst into sudden, murderous action. Loathing was pouring off of him, as thick as the rain. Naruto took a step forward, away from his teacher's side. You're sorry. He shouted. It's a little late to be sorry. Finally, Naruto was crying. He couldn't contain it anymore. You kidnap Sasuke, you kill my friends, and the best you can do is apologize. Naruto screamed. He staggered forward. Sakura was staring at him, along with Sasuke. The Haruno's mouth was pressed in a grim line. Do you think I care? Naruto was staring right into Nagato's soul Rinnegan. His tears ran freely, but his eyes were deadly and focused. I don't want an apology, he hissed. I want you dead. Nagato didn't flinch away. Blood sluggishly ran from his empty socket, leaking under his eyelid. Of course you do, he said. Jiraiya attempted to cross his arm and failed, watching his two students talk. The toads on his shoulders quietly bickered. Everything I've done, it's more than understandable. He coughed, weakly. My sole goal has been to break you. Nagato sighed. I was so sure, Naruto. That you were wrong, and that I was right. That all I had to do was show you, and that you would finally understand. Maybe even come of your own will. Naruto spat in Nagato's face. The redhead didn't react. I was wrong. He sagged in his armature. You've experienced my pain, Naruto. I took all I could from you. He grimaced. But you didn't understand. Maybe you never could have. I gambled everything on my pain being greater than yours, and now, I've lost everything. His gaze shifted to Konan, still unconscious. Mostly everything, he amended. I don't care. Naruto's voice was nothing like it had been just an hour before. It was a flat, cold blade, jabbed between Nagato's ribs. The redhead smiled bitterly. Of course you don't. The two students stared at each other for another moment. Is that all you have to say? Naruto said. The fire in his gut was burning out, leaving behind ash and acid. He felt nothing but hollowness and exhaustion. The world had seemingly shrunk to him and Nagato, even a Megakure's endless reign no longer registered. The man who had broken Naruto shook his head. We both have the same dream, Naruto Uzumaki, even if we've found different answers. Naruto stiffened. However much he wanted to deny it, Nagato was speaking truth. That was my mistake here. If either of us had triumphed over the other, that dream would have remained alive. Nagato broke away, staring up into the rain. But I chose to salt the earth rather than risk your answer triumphing over mine. I never had an answer, Naruto whispered. You still don't, Nagato responded. But you're young. These things take time. He coughed up yet more blood, staining his teeth once more. Now, my mistake has killed our hopes. Jiraiya may still fight for peace. He nodded towards his master, who just glared back, but I am dying, and in my arrogance I broke you. The world's next best chance. He leaned back with a whistling breath. That is why I asked to talk to you. And that is why I must make amends. There's nothing left for you. Sasuke finally spoke up, limping to Naruto's side. He cast a look back at his brother and Sakura. You wasted your time trying to save the world, he muttered, glancing at Konan, instead of what you had left. All that's left is for you to die. Nagato frowned. I will die, he said, and Naruto stared at him, an invisible weight lifting off his shoulders. The drum in his head grew just a bit quieter. But I refuse to die in vain. He turned to Jiraiya. Sensei. Would you do me a favor? The Sannin snorted. Nagato pressed ahead regardless. Wake Konan, he whispered, and the sage stiffened. I would like to say goodbye. And if she attacks? Jiraiya asked. Nagato shook his head. She won't. She'll listen to me. He grimaced in pain. Wake her. Please. Naruto watched the back and forth. He didn't care anymore. The voice in his head was still there. I'm sorry. Nagato was going to die. But it didn't matter. Not really. His friends were still dead. A Megakure's god, so frail in his throne, nothing but skin and bone, didn't matter anymore. He barely existed. Soon, he wouldn't. And Naruto's friends would still be dead. He watched Jiraiya approach Konan with flat eyes. His head ached. Jiraiya bent down, laying a hand on Conan's arm, and jolted her system with a shock of chakra. There was a slight glow as he did so, like a spark in the night. The paper woman shot to her feet, looking madly around. Her eyes landed on Jiraiya, and she swept back in a flurry of sheets, razor wings rising. "Conan," Nagato hoarsely whispered. His friend stopped, staring at him. She looked around, taking in the situation. Sasuke and Kakashi glared at her, 3 Sharingan gleaming in the dark. Naruto just kept staring at Nagato, unseeing. Conan looked back to the redhead. "No," she said. Her wings trembled. "Nagato. What happened to your eye?" She sounded ready to destroy the village all over again. Nagato sighed. "We've lost, Conan," he whispered. "No." Conan shook her head, fury streaming off of her. "I can still win here. My tags would be pointless," Nagato said harshly. "I'm a dead man, Conan." He gestured feebly at himself. "Can't you see it?" He took a ragged breath. "I just wanted to say goodbye." Conan cocked her head. Then, "Oh, Nagato." She sounded horrified. "You can't." "I must." "You'll waste yourself like that?" Conan demanded. "For him." She pointed at Naruto. "Look at him. You made him a shell, you got what you wanted. You'll undo all that now. What's the alternative?" Nagato shouted roughly, his voice cracking. Conan stared at him, her eyes wide and frantic. "That I die, and he walk away from here useless." He shook his head violently. "I won't have that, Conan. I refuse. Your dream dash. He will carry it." Nagato hissed. "You've been my pillar, Conan, and my friend, but I've failed. It's not up to me anymore." Naruto finally spoke up. "Your dream?" he asked. Both Conan and Nagato turned to him. "Why should I?" He shook. "Why should I carry it, when you took so much?" Nagato glared at him with his single eye, manic. His gaunt face seemed to stretch into a rictus parody of itself. "I took it," he whispered. "I took your friends, Naruto. I destroyed another answer because I disagreed with it. Like a petulant, foolish child." Without ceremony, he raised his hands, clasping them in a simple sign, 2 fingers extended from each hand, 1 pair nestled in the other hand's palm. "I had no faith," he rasped. Jiraiya was staring now, along with Kakashi. They felt something coming, but had no idea what. "No faith that anyone else could find an answer." Nagato laughed. "But now, it seems I have no choice but to be selfish." He shook his head. "Take away one of your burdens, and replace it with another." The Rinnegan pinned Naruto. "I'll put my faith in you, Naruto Uzumaki. Better that you carry our dream a bit farther, rather than it drown in this ruin I have created." "Nagato," Conan whispered, her eyes imploring. "Nagato, please." Her friend turned to her. For the first time in a long time, Nagato Uzumaki smiled. "I took his friends, Conan," he said, his voice failing. "It's only fair that I give them back." The ash in Naruto's stomach exploded into fire. The acid vanished. His head pounded once, intensely, and then the world snapped back. The rain, the wreckage of Omegakure, Jiraiya, Kakashi, Sakura, Sasuke, and Itachi. They were suddenly there, real. Nagato trembled, his hands shaking, and Naruto's eyes locked on him. The rain was deafening. "What?" Naruto rasped. He couldn't move. "What the hell are you saying?" "Please, Nagato," Conan gasped. "Don't leave dash." "It's okay, Conan." Nagato's voice was soft and sure. "It's all right. This is the consequence of my decisions. I'm setting a new path." He craned his head to look her in the eyes. "Do what you want when I am gone, what is left of the village is yours." He chuckled. "You will be their new god." Naruto broke, rushing forward. Jiraiya caught him, the sage's eyes were wide with something no one there could identify. "What the hell are you dash?" "Godot," Nagato gasped, sounding like he was bearing the weight of the world. Rein Tensei. Somewhere deep within the ruins of Omegakur, a great face erupted from the ground in an invisible explosion. It silently stared out over the wreckage of the village, the eternal rain passing right through it. Then, it opened its mouth impossibly wide. 6 spears of green light leapt out, soaring straight up into the sky and beyond the clouds. They froze for a moment, like archers picking their targets, and then bolted back downwards. Frozen shards of life, they fell from the sky like viridian lightning. Pain's last and first gift to Naruto Uzumaki burst through the clouds, carrying with it Nagato's final hope. Hayashi Hyuga turned back towards the village hidden in the rain, his brow furrowing. His daughter's body light in his arms swayed with the motion, her sodden hair half-heartedly swinging. What is it? Tsuminyazuka had finally released her son, now they walked side by side with their nin dogs, a hunting pack with nothing to hunt. The group had just moved beyond the rain, the downpour abruptly terminated at the edges of the village, creating a curtain of water and mist. Yamato shook his head dully, he'd tired himself out carving a path out of Omegakur with the Mokuton, simultaneously running a vanguard and rearguard action. He was carrying Niji Hyuga's corpse, hanging from the crook of his arm. Hayashi's eyes narrowed. Something is coming. Inoichi let out a brief, aborted laugh. Something. Perhaps you could be a little more specific, Hayashi. Beside him, Ino followed Hayashi's gaze up towards the sky. Oh. She whispered. Her father looked to her and then towards what had caught her attention. 5 green spears descended from the sky, making their way directly towards the group of Leaf Nin. What on earth? Shizune had slung Rock Lee's broken body over one shoulder, and Tenten's over the other. She instinctively clutched them tighter at the sight of the lights. Shibuya Barame, carrying his own son's body, wordlessly turned and began running, his stride tearing up the concrete bridge beneath his feet. The rest of the group followed after a moment's pause. The light had emerged from Omegakur, it was almost certainly nothing good. The way it streaked towards them seemed to confirm their fears. This was some weapon of pain, striking at them from within the village. It moved faster, faster. The retrieval team's initial burst of speed had carried them away from the glowing bolts, but now the light had accelerated enough to begin to gain. The gap closed, the green streaks clearing the curtain of rain. A kilometer, 800 meters, 500, 200, 100 meters. It would strike at any moment. It was at that exact second, as the vivid lights sped into an undodgeable vector, that Hayashi Hyuga realized what their targets were, himself, Shizune, Shivi, and Yamato. The only common factor there was that they were all carrying bodies. No, he realized. They weren't the targets. The bodies were his daughter, and her peers. Hayashi frowned, what faint rain there was beyond the village whipping past his face. There was no sensible reason for that to be the case. No reason for Pain to target the corpses of ninja he had already slain. It made no sense, an utter waste of chakra. Nevertheless, the light grew closer and closer. It was barely 10 meters away now. Hayashi poured on another burst of speed, but all it accomplished was buying him another half-second. The light reached Yamato first. Tired as the Mokuton user was, he lagged behind the group by a half-step. The brilliant green bolt hit Niji Hyuga's body like a lightning strike, and Yamato cursed. He dropped the broken, pierced Hyuga, half expecting him to explode or something similarly gruesome. Hayashi winced, the most microscopic of motions, as his nephew's body hit the ground and rolled. Tenten and Rock Lee were next, both bodies jerking as the light hit them. Shizune stopped, closing her eyes, and waited for whatever was next. Kiba Inuzuka leapt in front of the second-to-last beam, his fangs bared, but it did him no good. The light sailed right through his stomach and buried itself in Shivi's son, still held in his father's arms. Just as Hayashi was holding Hinata. He was the last to be struck, the green bolt soared right for his daughter, uncaring that he was between it and her. Hayashi could see it coming from behind through the Byakugan. It was just outside his blind spot. There was nothing he could do to stop it. That didn't stop him from trying. Hayashi cradled Hinata's body close, trying to saturate it with his chakra. If he moved enough into her system, It was possible that Pain's jutsu wouldn't be able to gain a foothold. It was an impossible endeavor. Hinata had been dead long enough that her system was completely dry. Attempting to introduce more non-hostile chakra was like trying to fill a dam with water pumped through a straw. The Viridian light struck him in the back, pouring out through his chest and into his daughter's body. Hayashi stared at it, his face a statue. He blinked. It looked familiar. The light looked familiar. Felt familiar. It sunk into Hinata's body, and Hayashi stared down. There was something inside him, screaming out. Something that was absolutely impossible. Kiba's Nindog barked viciously, sitting at his master's side. The Inyazuka was glaring at Shino's body, waiting for the unknown. The rest of the retrieval team was all frozen, barely breathing. Whatever was about to happen, it would doubtlessly be bad. Niji twitched. The entire retrieval team's gaze snapped to him, eyes going wide. The teen slowly rolled over, getting his hands under him, and laboriously pushed himself to his feet. He stared at his uncle with uncomprehending eyes. The holes in his hand, shoulder, and chest were gone as though they'd never been. He smacked his lips, as if waking up from a long nap, and blinked. "Ow," he muttered. Suddenly, comprehension returned. He lurched back, his hand going to his chest. The retrieval team backed away as well. Kiba said something that made his mother unconsciously slap him upside the head. "What?" Niji looked at Hayashi again, this time with eyes that were full of confusion and desperation. "Uncle? How, why are you dash?" Rock Lee yawned, stretching his arms. Shizun screeched and dropped him to the bridge, and the enthusiastic ninja's yawn turned into a muffled, slurred protest. Tenten seemed to snap awake, looking around wildly, and wrestled herself from Shizun's grasp as well, smashing to the ground and rolling towards Lee. They ended up crashing into each other with a panicked noise, and both leapt to their feet, circling back to back. Lee's hands dropped first, and he stood there like a stringless puppet. The retrieval team looked around wildly as the dead sprang back to life. Shino was next. One moment he was a corpse, and the next he was tapping his father's arm. "Where are we?" the Abarame croaked. Shivi looked at him expressionlessly, and then set him down without a word. The teen stumbled for a moment, and then regained his footing, staring around with his usual deadpan expression. Kiba watched him with an incredulous look, staggering forward. "Shino!" He clapped his hand down on his teammate's shoulder. "Shino, what the fuck?" Shino stared back through his opaque glasses, his brow wrinkled. "Kiba? I don't understand. How are we here? I was sure Pain had." He paused, his hand wandering towards his gut. "Wasn't I injured?" The Abarame's hand dropped. "Ah. I must be dead." Kiba laughed harshly. It sounded like a bark. He shook Shino by the shoulder. "You were." Hayashi didn't pay any attention to whatever else passed between the undead rookies and the rest of his retrieval team. He was entirely focused on his daughter's body. Hinata took a sudden, sharp breath, her eyes snapping open. She stared up at him, impossibly healthy, inexplicably alive. She blinked, and it was the most beautiful thing Hayashi had ever seen. "Father." Hayashi opened his mouth. He had no idea what he was going to say. Koji Akimichi, who had made an abrupt about-face as soon as Shino had regained consciousness, interrupted him. The teen was sprinting back across the bridge into the rain, tears streaming down his cheeks. He opened his mouth, screaming at the top of his lungs as he pounded back towards the village, Ino and her father desperately sprinting after him. "Shikamaru!" Shikamaru Nara woke from the deepest sleep he'd ever had. He sat up, his eyes only half open, and blearily looked around. The last thing he remembered was a blinding white light, and an unbearable heat. Had he fallen asleep in the sun again? He could have sworn. A drop of rain hit him in the eye, and Shikamaru blinked. It was only then that he realized he was sitting in the middle of a downpour. He frowned, looking around. He was in the center of an absolutely enormous crater. There wasn't a standing building around for kilometers, all that was left was dust and rubble. What hadn't been torn to bits was melted and burned. What hadn't been melted and burned had been reduced to dark spots on the ground, steadily being washed away by the rain. Some sort of unthinkable explosion of energy had occurred here. Shikamaru blinked again, and suddenly the vivid sensation of his arms and legs bidding his body farewell leapt from his memory. He clutched his head, curling over in the rain, and bared his teeth. He finally said, looking around once more and trying to comprehend what could have caused such destruction. There was only one word he could have used to describe it. That word was, of course, troublesome. What came instead was rather different. What the foo dash? It's done. Konan sagged, and Pain's hands bonelessly fell to his sides. He rattled out a single, long breath, his whole body leaning forward. His hair draped itself over his pale face, hiding his eye socket. What's done? Naruto rasped. He looked back and forth between the two, the last remnants of the original Akatsuki. What's done? Your comrades. Konan didn't look at him as she spoke. She continued to stare at Nagato, taking in each of his gasping, fading breaths. Nagato brought them back. Naruto blinked, whipping his head towards Nagato. Neither of them said anything. Jiraiya's two students stared at each other, Nagato's Rinnegan gleaming in the dark. Slowly, the purple eye began to dim. Jiraiya stepped forward. Impossible. He shook his head. Impossible. If he could do that. I didn't know how, sensei, Nagato whispered, his voice little more than the hiss of escaping air. And by the time I divined the method, Yahiko had moved on. And he shared a dark glance with Konan, who gazed back mournfully. We judged the cost too high. Jiraiya stopped, staring down his student. Nagato sighed, barely heard over the pounding rain. Naruto was still staring at him, unblinking. The whisper in the Jinchuriki's mind had vanished. Instead, all he could hear was his own heart pounding, louder and louder with each beat. It wasn't just his. It was far too loud to be just his. This was 6 hearts, all beating anew at the same time, so loud he was sure the sound would burst his own. Naruto curled in on himself, recently dried eyes wet with tears again. He clutched his chest, feeling the heartbeats as though they were his own, and gritted his teeth. The blood thrumming through his body, and the rain, hurling down and exploding around him, swallowed the grinding sound. Thump. 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 That's it, Nagato said, shifting one last time to glance at Nagato as the blonde looked up, barely seeing through clouded eyes. I'm done. Nagato's head hung low, as if he were in a deep sleep. Naruto took a step forward, and Konan swept in front of the redhead, arms extended defensively. She shook her head. I'm sorry, Jiraiya, Naruto. I did my best. Nagato's voice and the rain were nearly interchangeable. I tried, however much a waste it was. He heaved one last infinitely heavy breath. Konan closed her eyes. Let's hope you both have better luck. The light faded from Nagato's eye, and like a rusty door, his eye gradually shut. His shoulders glacially, almost gently, slumped forward, his body hanging limply in his armature. Suddenly, he looked more like an old, frayed puppet than a man, left in the village to rot. The blood running from his nose and eye socket seemed to Naruto like discarded red string, abandoned and draped over his body. Nagato didn't look happy by any metric, but Naruto couldn't shake the feeling he almost looked satisfied. Carefully, Jiraiya moved up, towards Konan. He shared a look with his former student, and then laid his hand down on her shoulder. The woman shuddered, shaking her head again, and then stepped aside. Jiraiya strode to Nagato's body, laying his hand on the man's neck. He remained there for a moment, checking the pulse of a Megakure's god. When he wordlessly pulled back, Naruto knew that there was no question. Pain was dead. Naruto stared at the body, rooted where he was. A crimson tidal wave swept through his mind, wiping everything away. The heartbeats, having momentarily retreated, replaced the rain, echoing through his head. Are you really that selfish? That you would throw all of them away, just for another? Thump. Give up. Thump. Your sacrifice will be the one that matters. Thump. You didn't really feel pain, Naruto. Thump. Your friends are dead. Thump. Your village will think you a disgrace. Thump. That thing you carry could bring this world peace, but you're too frightened to use it. Thump. And you have no plan. Submit. Thump. You, Naruto Uzumaki, will be the change that brings peace to the shinobi world. Naruto shook, his hands clenching. Past all that, past all the hatred and threats and rain and blood and fear. It seems I have no choice but to be selfish. I'll put my faith in you, Naruto, better that you carry our dream a bit farther, rather than it drown in this ruin I have created. Naruto's hand clenched, still over his chest. The heartbeats stopped. He collapsed to his knees with a ragged gasp. Hey! Naruto! Jiraiya was moving towards him down a very narrow tunnel, his face twisting in concern. Naruto sucked in another breath, his grip over his heart tightening. He collapsed on his back, his legs folding under him. Naruto. That was all there was down here, the rain, and his name. Sakura's face interspersed itself between him and the sky. Naruto blinked, his vision gradually going white. It looked like the world was being sucked into a brilliant void. A second later, Kakashi's face joined Sakura's, the both of them staring down at him. Sasuke arrived barely a moment afterwards, his slate black eyes barely familiar. Naruto. The void swallowed the world, and Naruto Uzumaki closed his eyes. Not Sick Chapter 29. Spider's Web. How do you accept the reality of your own death? Shikamaru stared at the back of his hand, flexing his fingers and watching the play of tightening tendons and stretching skin. His lungs sounded like gargantuan bellows, echoing through his mind. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The sound of his own breathing seemed deafening to him, a cacophony of gushing blood and rushing air. He almost couldn't understand how people endured it. But he could understand. He'd barely noticed it a week ago. What had changed? Oh. Right. He blinked, the sensation of his eyes moistening almost disgusting. Muscles, dancing beneath the skin, brought the lids down and then pulled them back up, yanking his eyelids open like curtains. The subtle change in light as his pupils dilated for the briefest of moments before resettling seemed to him a strobe. He took another breath, his chest expanding, his ribs pushing out. He was sure they would creak. Shikamaru. His mother's voice was just as deafening as his own breathing. He could imagine the way the sound resonated in his ears, carried by the tiny movement of infinitesimal hair-like cells down the nerves leading to his brain. The notion made him nauseous. Even a shinobi like him, someone who could go head-to-head with a stone wall and come out the winner, was so fragile when it came down to it. Pain had torn his body apart like wet paper with that suicidal detonation. The distant fire of all but one of his limbs being ripped away by an unbearable pressure and heat sent Shikamaru shivering. His other hand, resting behind his head, began digging into the skin of his neck, sending more impulses racing down his spine and up to his knuckles. His door opened, it didn't squeak. His mother peeked her head through, her brow drawn into an unidentifiable emotion. Shikamaru. She was quieter than she usually was, her dark eyes piercing his. Do you want lunch? He blinked, the slide of flesh over the semi-solid surface of his eye distracting him once more, and considered. Was he hungry? Yes, the vague grumbling in his stomach told him so. Could he stomach eating? Probably not. I'm good. He put his hand down, laying it by his side on the bed. His room was dark, and as his mother opened the door a bit wider, more light poured into it, pushing the shadows back. They were such fragile things. Yoshino took a step into the room, and then another. She clearly didn't know what to say. Shikamaru could sympathize, she clearly thought her ordinary domineering nature wouldn't cut it here. He wasn't sure if she was right or not. Is there anything you do need? She asked. She drew closer, and Shikamaru considered that question too. I don't think so, he decided in a rather monotone voice. His mother sat down on his bed, and Shikamaru turned his head towards her. She was looking right at him with a laser-like gaze. He unconsciously recoiled just the slightest bit, and her lip twisted. We both know that's a lie, she said. Shikamaru snorted. Is this the part where you analyze my delicate psyche? His mother didn't snap at him, which he'd been expecting. Maybe wanting a little, too. Instead, there was just a heavy silence. Finally, she sighed. You went and got yourself killed, she grimaced. I always worried about you doing nothing with your life, and then you go kill and get killed by an S-rank missing nin. She snorted, her shoulders shaking, and one of her hands came up to her eye. What a mess. Shikamaru frowned. I thought you'd be mad. Not now. His mother wiped away a tear. Shikamaru watched it run down her finger, leaving a trail of dampness. How could I be mad now? I got myself killed. Shikamaru's frown intensified. I should be mad. But you're not. Shikamaru shook just a little. It might have been a laugh on another day. Now, it was more of a hollow rattle in his throat. There it is. His mother made a similar noise. We don't have to do this today, she said, teeth shining as another tear slipped down her cheek. Your father should probably be there for it, too. Shikamaru shrugged, and Yoshino rose from the side of his bed. You know. Shikamaru's voice stopped his mother, but she didn't turn around. He blew me up. The phrasing was almost childish, but the way Yoshino's spine straightened out wasn't. His mother let out a ragged breath, her whole body shaking. Shikamaru continued. It hurt. A lot, actually. He looked away, back to the ceiling, now overcome with light from the hallway. I didn't really have time to be surprised, or angry. Just, boom. His lip twisted. But there was one thing that bothered me. I wondered if it was karma. His mom didn't interrupt him. She must have known, just as well as he, that this was just something he had to say. Even if it didn't really make sense. That bastard who killed Asuma-sensei. Haiden. I wrapped him up and blew him into a million pieces, Shikamaru said peacefully, and his mother nodded. She'd read the reports, though she'd never gotten the whole story from her husband. Just that their son had been instrumental in taking down the man who'd murdered his teacher. It was the right thing to do, Shikamaru continued. I've got no doubt of that. He was a rabid dog, and someone needed to bury him. I was just put into the position to. Finally, some doubt crept into his voice. But I can't help but think, if it was the right thing to do, why did the exact same thing happen to me? His mother didn't turn around. She just kept staring towards the open door, and the light that crept in. After a moment or two, she started walking again, her shoulders drawing up with every step. Her shadow flitted over her son, and Shikamaru wished for a second that he could hug it close. If you need anything, just call, okay? Yoshino said. Her son nodded, and she made her way towards the door. But as she reached the threshold, she turned back. You did the right thing. Shikamaru sighed shakily, and his mother smiled. I love you, she said, and her voice was like a rock in a violent ocean. Shikamaru wanted to grimace. He really did. I love you too, Mom. His mother smiled again, and left. Shikamaru kept staring at the ceiling as she closed the door, and shadows overtook the room again. He studied them, squinting, as if he could perceive the exact nature of the muted light. Light poured around a shadow. If light met it, light overcame it. It was an effortless law of the world, as intrinsic as gravity. He wondered if he and the shadows were the same. You must always be possessed by a strange feeling that you're still dead. 600. Tenten sat, not caring about the wet grass under her, and watched Lee execute his third set of push-ups. The sweating boy lowered himself down on a single trembling handset under his solar plexus, his fingers twitching and driving divots into the soft ground. The training field was mostly silent but for the sound of distant birds and Lee's grunts. Her teammate breathed out harshly and pushed himself back up, his legs hanging taut above the ground. More sweat dripped into his eyebrows and disappeared, absorbed by the thick hair. 601, Lee panted, and switched hands. He pushed upwards, going airborne for a moment, and his left hand came out under him. He landed on it with a pained growl and then froze for a moment, settling himself and ensuring his balance. Then, he started again. Tenten's fingers curled around the hilt of the axe buried in the ground beside her, and tapped a rhythm there as she watched Lee work. Watching the play of muscles was almost hypnotic. It was impossible to think that they'd been dead, worked to disintegration, so recently. Along with her. The axe's handle creaked slightly, and she released it, bringing her hand back to her lip. The sun seemed almost oppressive. Tenten was still getting used to the idea that it was there. She'd been sure she'd never see it again. So. Guy-sensei's voice was like a crack of thunder in the relative tranquility of the sunny day. Tenten's head snapped towards it, the axe she'd let go of already in her hands and raised to a defensive position. The voice had come from above. How was that dash? Guy hit the ground like a small green meteor, throwing up a wave of sundered dirt and grass. Lee didn't waver in his exercise, while Tenten jumped to her feet in surprise. Her sensei reared up, his teeth shining in the midday sun, as the earth settled around him. Where had he come from? A dash. He paused for a second, and Tenten tilted her head as she realized that for one of the first times she could remember, her teacher was at a loss for words. Guy's whole body relaxed, his arms hung at his side, and his head dropped. My dear students, he started anew. I have just returned from my 200th A rank mission. His expression shifted, something dark passing over his face. Lee finally looked up from his push UPS, his exhausted face registering his sensei's presence. He slowly lowered himself down, preparing to get to his feet. I reported to the Hokage when I returned, of course. Guy sniffed. She gave me the most disturbing news. Lee finally made it to his feet, and as he did, Guy spread his arms. My youthful students. There was a blur of movement, and Tenten found herself wrapped in Might Guy's arms. Lee was there too, just as confused as her if a great deal sweatier. Her teacher let out a mighty sob and pulled them both closer. I have never been more proud of you. Guy bawled. Tenten stiffened. That hadn't been what she was expecting. Lee still hadn't said a word, but Tenten felt him shake just a bit at their teacher's words. Guy pushed them out to arm length and beamed at them. You protected your comrades. Guy grinned. Followed them into the arms of death itself, and fought your way back out. You too dash. He looked around, his exuberance not fading. And Niji. Your youthful fire burned so brightly in the village hidden in the rain you warded off death itself. You already said that, Tenten pointed out, grinning for a reason she really couldn't understand. Her teacher was being ridiculous. Even more so than usual. Guy nodded. Enthusiastically. I did. It is something that bears repeating. His eyes crinkled. How do you feel, Tenten? She looked down at herself. At her hands, trembling just slightly, her mud-soaked pant legs. She tried to look at more than just herself, but all she could find inside was the whistling of the wind and the chirping of birds. The kunoichi Tenten had disarmed a god and returned from death, and she wasn't quite sure what to do with that information. Tired, she eventually decided, truthfully. Her sensei nodded, an incredibly serious look falling over his face. His hand came up, cupping his chin. Yes, he said, still serious. I can imagine that resurrection is a tiring experience. His eyes narrowed. I would not know, since it has never happened to me. Tenten resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She couldn't decide if her teacher was being stupid, or if this conversation was actually helping her. Konoha's green beast turned to Lee, and his smaller lookalike gazed at him with dark eyes. Teacher and student met each other's gazes for a moment, and as always, Tenten knew that she was missing some sort of invisible communication between them. After what seemed like several seconds, Guy spoke. And you, Lee. His tone was infinitely more sober. Lee considered. Tenten could see he already had the answer to the question in mind, he was searching for the words to voice it. I am training, he finally said. Tenten blinked at the flatness of the phrase. Lee's usual enthusiasm was subdued. Their sensei noticed it too, his feet shifting slightly in the damp grass. I am glad your youthful fire hasn't been dimmed by your death, he said, the ridiculous sentence granted a frightening solidity by the man's solemn voice. Lee nodded, and Guy cocked his head. Why are you training? Lee blinked. Guy-sensei. Guy crossed his arms. Why are you training? The question sounded like a challenge, and Lee didn't back down. His body tensed, still shaking slightly with exertion and dripping with sweat. Because I failed. Next time I will not. Tenten finally spoke up. That's not true. Lee glanced at her, and she shook her head. Lee, you can't believe dash. I did not defeat pain. Lee's voice was just as precise as his kicks. I was unable to handle the strain of the seventh gate, and died for it. At the mention of the gates, Guy gave a near imperceptible twitch, the beginnings of a frown stealing over his face. I failed you, and Neji, Naruto, everyone. Lee grimaced, the look unusual and unbecoming. And I will not again. That is why I am training. The next time I am faced with an undefeatable opponent, I refuse to use my life as payment. Guy allowed the sober silence that Lee had created to last about 5 seconds. It is good, he finally said, that you recognize your error. Tenten turned to him in surprise as her sensei continued. That goes for the both of you. You did a very brave thing, but it was also exceptionally foolish. It is only by pure chance that you two, and Neji, remain as my youthful students. I would not have liked to bury you. Guy grinned. But if you truly are my students, then you will not let this reminder of your mortality dull your mind or slow your actions. He pounded his fists together, and some of Lee's fire returned to him. Tenten found herself smiling once more. You have been given a second chance, and I have no doubt, that you all will use it well. He held out a hand to Tenten, and one to Lee. There was a tear glistening in the corner of one of his eyes, and Guy let out a mighty sniff. Now, what say you, my youthful protege? Shall we track down that sour teammate of yours, and with him at our side, run 100 laps around the village? Tenten stared at Guy's hand, calloused and slightly bruised, the hand of a man who had spent every day of his life breaking the unbreakable. Then, she turned to Lee. If we do not bring him with us, she said, a smile breaking out, then we shall run 200 laps. For a moment, Lee just stared back at her, his dark eyes searching. Then, he grinned, and took their teacher's hand. Splendid. Guy bawled, trying to pull both of his students in for a hug. Tenten resisted for just a moment, before allowing herself to be drawn in. Just this once, she decided. There was a tear in her eye as well, and she didn't know why it was there. That you shouldn't be here. 2 days since her rebirth. Hinata Hyuga sat very still, looking out over her family's compound. It was beset by cruelly cold wind, whistling through the narrow rice walls and echoing off the concrete ones. Most of her clansmen had retreated inside, away from the chill. The sun was somewhere above her, high in the sky, but its light had been masked by soggy clouds, turning the world a sepia gray. She stared down at the pale grass around her bare feet, reveling in the feeling of mud against her toes, of blood rushing to her chilled extremities. It had been a little more than 34 hours since her death in a Megakure. She'd slept for 5 of those, in the stark, confusing time after she'd returned from the dead into Konoha, but before the sun had risen. Hinata was surprised she'd managed that. Her mind had been whirling, an internal invisible monsoon that had made a Megakure's rain seem a drizzle by comparison, but as soon as she'd rested for a moment the world had vanished, and she'd found herself waking up in her own bed. Now, she sat on the wooden steps leading to her room. The robe she was wearing was just as gray as the sky, but it kept her warm against the wind. Should I go to him? That was the wind's accompaniment. If the cutting air was the orchestra, Hinata's mind was the chorus. Should I go to him? They weren't producing an especially complex repetition, but it was a new one all the same. It seemed almost funny, and even a little abominable to Hinata, that was the thought matching the wind whisper for whisper. She'd died. She'd felt pain's weapon burst through her heart. If she closed her eyes, she felt the agony all over again, the cold metal scraping past her ribs and taking her life with it. The sudden impact, the way her body had slammed down on top of Naruto's, the spike impaling her digging into him as well, their blood mingling for a moment before the rain washed it away. Coldness spreading across her body as her brain struggled to catch up to the fact that it was already dead. Hinata twitched. I'm sorry. She had been sorry. Sorry that she'd died after he'd asked her to not. It felt sick. What kind of person apologized for her own death? She wasn't that pathetic, was she? Hinata didn't know. In fact, Hinata didn't know seemed to be a bit of a running theme for her at the moment. She didn't know how to feel about her own death. She didn't know how to feel about the fact that she'd come back. She didn't know if she were pathetic or kind or both for apologizing for it. And she didn't know if she should, or could, go see Naruto now. At least, she affirmed to herself, she knew she'd made the right decision. Sister. Hinata turned her head, the motion barely begun before her Byakugan silently activated, the Dojutsu shrunk away in the same second. Her little sister was standing behind her, the leather jacket she'd adopted after her graduation limp around her shoulders. Hanabi looked just as uncertain as Hinata felt, her smaller, thinner features virtually a copy of Hinata's own. The tiny Hyuga spoke. Can I sit down? Hinata blinked. Of course. Usually, Hanabi didn't ask. Her sister approached like someone walking down death row, or towards the bed of a terminally ill parent, and plopped down next to her. There was a moment of silence as they both stared out over the windswept compound, trying to figure out what the other was thinking. Hanabi was, in many ways, a mystery to Hinata, and she knew she was the same to her sister. While they got along, it would never be a completely natural connection. Hanabi was loud where Hinata was quiet, confident where she was frightened, skillful where she struggled. They were, in almost all aspects, opposites. But they were still sisters. Did it hurt? Hanabi's tone was as impossible to reconcile with reality as the rest of the situation, quiet, and almost fearful. Hinata considered the question. There was only one thing her sister could be asking about. Yes, she finally decided. Hanabi let out a muffled "oh" and continued to stare at the compound, her hand coming up and twisting her hair. Hinata turned towards her just slightly, and after another silent moment amended a question. Who told you? The details of what had happened in Omegakure weren't common knowledge, Hinata doubted they ever would be. For Hanabi to know, she must have been told by Father. The ghost of a familiar smirk flitted across her sister's face, before suffering an abrupt exorcism. He told me not to bother you, but he thought I should know. Hinata nodded, not especially surprised by the answer. It did hurt, she said. But I don't regret it. She paused, her mouth twisting, as her sister's head swiveled towards her. Why had she said that? Because it's true. You don't regret it? Hanabi asked incredulously. Dying. The word finally emerged, only slightly strained. The wind picked up, rattling the door behind them, and Hinata drew her legs in towards her body, away from the mud. No, she said, half to herself and half to her little sister. I don't think I do. Hanabi's face twisted. But you said it hurt. She was struggling to understand what her sister was saying. It did, Hinata affirmed. It hurt more than anything else I can think of. But just because something hurts, it doesn't mean it's bad. Hanabi was watching her cockeyed. You sure you didn't get stabbed in the brain or something? She asked, before stiffening as she heard her own words. Hinata's eyes went wide, and then after a frozen second she burst out laughing. Hanabi rocked back, expecting something else, but eventually a sly grin stole her lips. Hinata shook her head, trying to regain her decorum. I'm not saying dying was good, she giggled, the surrealism of the conversation desperately trying to lock her mouth. Just that it was the right decision. Why? Dying to save another. Niji made himself known, startling both the sisters. He stood in the faint shadow of the overhead awning, leaning against a support beam, his eyes closed and his arms crossed. It is rarely the wrong decision. Hanabi turned back to her sister, her eyes narrowed. Who'd you save? The question went unanswered, but at Hinata's slight blush Hanabi rolled her eyes. The answer was already obvious. You don't blame him. Niji's voice wasn't cold, just curious. Hinata frowned. Of course not, she mumbled. She could sense Niji's nod, the bare movement in her peripheral vision. Nor I, he said slowly. Then he turned, and strode back inside the compound, leaving Hinata with her sister. She looked to Hanabi once more, and the smaller girl gave her a smile that was both scared and coy. "I'm glad you are not dead," Hanabi murmured, scooting a bit closer. Her smile grew a tad more mischievous. "So, are you going to go see him?" Hinata's brow creased. Oakman. Hanabi frowned. "After what you did, talking to you would be the least he could do." Hinata looked back to the courtyard, away from her fuming sister. She should go see him, yes. It would probably do good for both of them, however much she feared it. But Hinata was afraid. It wasn't the familiar fear of stepping into the sun, either. Not the fear of judgment or misunderstanding. This was a subtler, cloying fear. This was a fear that the Naruto she would meet if she went today wouldn't be the one she'd died for. That the one who died and the one who returned are not one and the same. Niji moved back inside the compound, leaving Hinata and her sister on the porch. He let out a silent breath, moving silently over the paneled wood. The wind whispered outside, and his forehead itched under his Hitai. Unconsciously, his hand came up towards it, before dropping limply. He looked around, a languid movement of the neck, before letting out another slow breath. He spun, suddenly moving with new purpose. His Byakugan shone, invisible gears viciously rotating behind it. Niji's pace grew longer and longer, his steps more confident. The air was practically bristling with intent. It wasn't violent, simply focused. He moved through a dividing door, opening and closing it with a sharp snap, and came to a second, closed one. This one, he opened more slowly. Behind it, Hayashi Hyuga sat, his legs tucked under him and his hands set in his lap. His eyes were closed, and his brow furrowed. He looked to be concentrating fiercely. This was the dojo. The room was plain, without ornamentation but for some pads in the corner. Niji didn't know why, but he knew Hayashi retreated here sometimes when he wished to be alone. He'd seen it with his dojutsu, the Hyuga clan head sitting silently, his eyes closed, his body unnaturally still. Niji normally didn't concern himself with the affairs of others, but if he had to guess, he supposed this place was the man's sanctuary from the voices of the clan, the room where he could hear his own thoughts the clearest. The impression was reinforced by the silent, reflective nature of the room. The floor was so clean Niji could swear he could see his reflection in it. "Uncle," he said, the short word almost startling in its bluntness. Hayashi turned his head towards him, his eyes opening. Blank pale eyes met, and Hayashi regarded his nephew with a muted curiosity. "Niji." Hayashi's voice was still as strong as iron, even if his eyes weren't. "We have a problem." His uncle blinked. "Is it Hinata?" Niji shook his head. "No." He hesitated, his sense of purpose not fading, but tempered for a moment by cold caution. "Do you know if anyone is nearby? Or coming to meet you?" Hayashi echoed Niji's shake of the head, his Byakugan flaring on and off for just a moment. For half a second, a flash of surprise leapt across his face at something only he could see, before vanishing. "No one is coming. And my daughters are the only ones nearby." His expression hardened. "Now tell me. Why have you come here?" With steady, careful hands, Niji reached up for his headband. In 2 quick motions, he undid the knot behind his head that was keeping it in place. The Hitai dropped with a thunk, rolling for a moment on the spotless dojo floor before going still. For that time, it was the only thing in the room that was moving. Both Niji and his uncle were frozen. "Ah," Hayashi eventually said. It was a tiny sound, quickly swallowed by the emptiness of the room. "Of course. You didn't know," Niji confirmed. His uncle's lips pursed. "I was too caught up with my daughter's fate, yes," he admitted, his expression shifting into a bitter sort of curiosity. "I should have realized this would have happened." Niji smiled grimly. "Has it ever occurred before?" "This time," Hayashi snorted. "No. There are no protocols to deal with this." The younger Hyuga silently nodded. He'd expected so. "What do we do, then?" Hayashi narrowed his eyes, staring at Niji's forehead. There was nothing there but pale skin, whiter than the area around it for lack of sunlight. The caged bird seal was gone. "I suppose you wouldn't allow me to reapply it?" Niji was the one to snort this time. "No. Hayashi smiled faintly. I had imagined. But Niji, you must recognize the impasse we are presented here. He stepped forward, his white robe whispering over the dojo floor. You are branch house. It is completely unprecedented for a member of it to escape or undo the Juinjutsu. You doing so represents something the more traditional members of the clan cannot and will not allow. And just the same, Niji said, crossing his arms, I cannot and will not allow myself to be placed back in a cage. Hayashi frowned, pausing. He and Niji were now less than 5 feet from each other. The older Hyuga's eyes kept wandering back to the other's unmarked forehead. You were right, then, he said. We do have a problem. This will cause trouble. Both in the clan, maybe in Konoha itself. Our politics are the village's politics, sooner or later. Good. Hayashi arched an eyebrow at Niji's declaration. Bold. Niji smiled back. He may have been attempting to be bland, but he couldn't keep a bit of viciousness, and real joy, from sneaking into his features. If Hinata-sama really does want to change the Hyuga, he said, or if Naruto wishes to live up to that promise he made, all those years ago. Hayashi had tensed just slightly at Naruto's name, but Niji ignored it. Then causing trouble will be our best chance. We will shatter this clan's tradition. We, Hayashi said softly, his eyes gaining back some of their frightening focus. You really are committed. Niji's silence was all the answer he needed. After a moment, the Hyuga patriarch nodded. We will see how this goes, then, he said, and Niji unconsciously showed some teeth. But Hayashi held up his hand. For now, this must remain a secret. If you are going to capitalize on this opportunity, you must ensure you do so correctly. You'll only have one chance. His brow furrowed. Tell my daughter. No one else. Then, after a pause. And leave, please. You've given me even more to think about. Niji bowed, turned, and retreated from the room. He didn't leave because he had to. Behind him, Hayashi sank back to his knees, and closed his eyes. Oh, the older Hyuga said. And prepare yourself. We have a peculiar visitor. Niji looked back at him, but Hayashi didn't elaborate. The older man had said no one was coming earlier. Slightly confused, the newly freed Jonin moved back to the porch he'd left his cousin on. When he arrived, he suddenly realized what his uncle had meant. Hinata was still sitting there, but she was silent now, a mix of shock and uncertainty. Hanabi was next to her, watching with hard eyes and tensed hands. Niji's own eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't ready his body. Whatever reason he was here for, fighting was doubtlessly not one of them. Hello, Sasuke Uchiha said. But that's not true. You don't seem any different. Shino looked at his father, and then back to his hive. The Kakaicha there writhed, moving with little purpose. Most of the hive still couldn't understand the notion of being returned to life, and were sluggish and unresponsive for it. It had barely been 2 days, after all. I am not, Shino said languidly. His insect sluggishness was slightly transferred to him. Here in his clan's compound, surrounded by the buzzing of other insects and with his father at his side, the feeling was slightly reduced. They stood in one of the primary hives, where the Abarame's allies were born and implanted in the clan's young. It was a familiar, friendly place, overrun with greenery and towering structures of dirts, roots, and melted fiber. Why would I be? You died, Shivi Abarame said rather calmly. Being near to death changes people. I've never known someone to return from it. He shifted, raising his arm and welcoming back some of his insects. I had feared you would change for the worst. I died on my own terms, Shino said. Defending my team. I had no regrets. His father mulled that one over, glancing at him through shaded lens. And yet, he eventually said, you're speaking much more directly than usual. Shino didn't respond to that immediately. Instead, he looked around, breathing deeply and slowly as he considered his father's words. Yes, he decided after several seconds. Why? Shivi asked. I am worried for them. Who they were was obvious. Shivi didn't interject as his son slowly continued. Kiba is guilty. He will be so for a long time. He believes he failed us. Shino frowned. And Hinata. I did not see what happened to her, but she has been acting unusual. The frown intensified, an unusual show of obvious emotion from the young Abarame. For what little time I've seen her. That was unavoidable, his father finally said. The Hokage. Of course, Shino agreed calmly. But I. For the first time, his words failed him, and his fists clenched. His insects buzzed for a moment with renewed life. I do not know, he decided. I just wish things were different. He shook his head. Pointless. It's not, Shivi said, laying his hand on his son's shoulder. Shino stiffened at the uncommon contact. If we did not wish for things to be different, things would never change. But what I wish to change has already happened, Shino dully pointed out. Then you must shape the future instead. His father squeezed his shoulder, and then let go. I must go. Tend to your allies, they'll need you more than ever now. Shivi turned and walked away, exiting the hive, and Shino looked down at his squirming Kikaicha. Something in his gut rolled. Allies, he murmured, watching one insect in particular roll over on its back and flutter madly, its wings opening and closing rapidly. Shino could feel its distress. Because it's not dying that changes you. Jiraiya didn't want to be here. Mayaboku always smelled sweet, almost to a sickening degree. The air was thick and humid, and the earth itself pulsed with bright chakra. It wasn't a place Jiraiya disliked by any means. Some of his fondest memories had been made here, working amongst and learning from the toads. But the older he got, the more he found that spending long stretches of time at Mount Mayaboku was exhausting. The place could be an assault on the senses, including some that only Jiraiya had. And there was more than that, at least right now. The steadily growing headache just behind Jiraiya's left ear wasn't just the product of the stifling humidity or the heavy stench of rotting insects. There was a rabid guilt gnawing at the toad sage's brain. Jiraiya shouldn't have been here. He should have been back in Konoha, with Naruto. His student needed a guiding hand at the moment, more than he ever had before. But when the elder called, when the sage of sages requested, via involuntarily summoning, your presence, you couldn't exactly turn it down. Jiraiya's mouth twitched slightly in annoyance as he mounted the great steps leading into the elder's lair. And a lair it definitely was, filled with impenetrable shadows and mysterious incense, with the elder himself seated in what looked like a rather comfortable throne. It was certainly impressive. Jiraiya had stolen its atmosphere for a book or two, so he knew better than anyone. But today, he could only regard it with a kind of bitter impatience. He should be with Naruto, not receiving yet another amendment to an old, inscrutable prophecy. The elder toad turned its massive, wrinkled head towards Jiraiya as he entered, foggy eyes narrowing. Gamabunta was standing behind him, a troubled look on his face. On the other side of the ancient toad, Fukazaku and his wife Shima stood with mirrored expressions. Jiraiya nodded to them and Gamabunta, and all three toads bent their heads back, looking grim. No one spoke, summon, or shinobi, they were all waiting for the elder. The sage of sages kept Jiraiya's gaze for another couple seconds, his eyes unusually focused. His vision seemed to pierce right through the uncountable cataracts that marred his eyes. For the first time, Jiraiya felt like the elder was looking at him. The timeless creature's gray skin was dry, and it opened its gargantuan mouth once, before closing it again, not breaking away from Jiraiya's eyes. Finally, it spoke. The prophecy is sundered, it croaked, like a cabinet depositing centuries' worth of dust on the floor. Jiraiya blinked. That hadn't been what he had been expecting to hear. Not at all. He stepped forward, his single hand coming up in a plaintive gesture. It wasn't the most articulate question, but it got his point across. It's gone, Jiraiya. Fukazaku didn't attach anything to the sage's name. Jiraiya frowned. If his teacher really was that serious, how can it be gone? It's the future, he asked. There was just a bit of accusation creeping into his tone. You said, all those years ago, you would be the one to train the shinobi who would bring great change. The elder suddenly cackled, and gleam in his eye, and Jiraiya had to resist the urge to jump back. He'd never seen the ancient toad so animated, It was like watching a trusted book spring to life. Were you lying? Jiraiya didn't know why he was shouting. There was something bitter and angry building up inside him, a wellspring of 25 years of disappointment and rage. Shima hung her head, while Fukazaku just watched, like a statue. Gamabunta shifted uncomfortably, his great bulk sliding across the floor. No, the elder said, suddenly sober. I cannot lie. Jiraiya huffed, his nostrils flaring. His hair unconsciously spiked out just slightly, as if preparing to launch a barrage of needles. I've trained 7 students, he said. I wanted to be a teacher, yes, but in the back of my head there was always that damn prophecy you gave me. His words became shorter, like cruelly barbed knives. 3 of them, I thought might be the one. But the first became a monster, the second died, and now the third. He choked, his hair suddenly falling limp. No. That can't be. Ah, Fukazaku said sadly. Now you see it. He was the one. Jiraiya demanded. He was the one, and now that I've failed again the prophecy is gone. The elder toad nodded. Sundered. I cannot see that path anymore. Jiraiya stood there for a moment, completely still and utterly silent. Then, he grunted, and turned to go. His violent steps left cracks in the stone beneath his feet. He walked as if he were trying to shatter his legs. That's it. He muttered, just loud enough for the rest to hear. Not much of a story, was it? His stride became longer, angrier. What a pathetic waste. Jiraiya. The sage stopped at Gamabunta's rumbling voice, turning his head back towards the group. The elder grinned at him, the toothless smile of a village idiot, and Jiraiya found himself grinding his teeth. At least, until the sage of sages spoke. The future is not fixed, the elder ground out, and suddenly Jiraiya was paying attention again. There is no path for us to tread. There are whirlpools and cycles, echoes and currents, but it would be pure foolishness to presume things set in stone. The elder's grin grew wider, and cannier. Jiraiya's anger was beginning to withdraw, like a tide after the full moon. A cold clarity was unearthed in its passing. When something older than most of Konoha combined speaks, you listen. The prophecy I gave you is dead and cold, drowned at the bottom of a rising tide. The Rinnegan severed it. The ancient toad rolled the word Rinnegan around like a stone on his tongue, as if tasting its power, before he continued. Now, the sons are uncertain, before, each knew the role the other would play, but now the stage is broken. One of them is circling, still confident, the other is unsure. I cannot see what will come. The sons. That was a word that would be capitalized in one of his books, Jiraiya knew for sure. And one he'd never heard mentioned by the elder before. A new variable. Where had it come from? The events in Omegacore, almost certainly. As Jiraiya's mind went into overdrive, the elder gave him a sickly grin. Congratulations, Jiraiya. You live in interesting times. The toad sage gave a passable grin back. Lucky me, he murmured, before raising his voice. Great elder, what do you mean by the sons? The elder toad laughed. Why, senseis of course. He gifted Jiraiya another toothless grin. You best be on your way now, sage of Konoha. Your student needs you. I suggest celebrating that he is alive, rather than lamenting the death he left behind. Despite his initial instinct, Jiraiya bowed. Thank you, elder, he said. I'll be on my way. He turned, giving the other toads a nod. As he strode towards the entrance, the place where his left arm should have been constantly burning with phantom pain, a thorny curiosity wormed into his brain. For just a moment, it supplanted his fear for his student. Sensei. It's what comes afterwards. Not sick chapter 30. Set the stage. Have you seen Shikamaru? Koji was eating slowly. The sight was more unsettling to Ino than she thought it had a right to be. The restaurant around them didn't care, the bustle of waiters taking orders, sizzling meat, slurping and chewing and laughter, demanding commands, obnoxious snorts, and a single breaking glass weren't slowed or dulled by Koji's unusually reasonable pace. No one there cared that Ino and Koji, and the other shinobi sitting with them, had almost died just 2 days ago. The Yamanaka poked at her salad with her fork. She couldn't stop noticing that the center prong was bent, just slightly. It made the whole thing seem unwieldy and useless. Ino. Kiba Inyazuka's rough voice brought her head snapping up. He was staring at her, his slit eyes slightly narrowed. She realized Koji had asked her a question, and redirected her attention to him. The Akimichi had been on edge since they'd returned. He'd taken on a very un-Koji-like brusqueness. The slabs of meat covering his plate steamed, the vapors distorting his face just slightly. She shook her head, answering his question and ignoring the clamor of the restaurant. No, she said, poking at her salad again. They'd usually come here as a team. When Asuma had died, those visits had slowed down, but hadn't stopped. He hasn't left his house much, she heard herself say. I don't know what he's up to. Koji leaned back, his mane relaxing. You're worried about him. Kiba was watching the both of them out of the corner of his eye. Ino barely knew why he and Akamaru were here. They'd found him in the street, escorting a battered Sai. Before any of them had known it, they'd been eating together. Ino blinked, finally responding to Koji's question. You're not. Her voice wasn't quite a hiss, but it shared a neighborhood with it. Koji frowned. Don't say it like that, he said, putting down his chopsticks. He leaned back farther, his head hitting the backboard of his seat. You know I am. But I think you and I are worrying differently. He died, Koji. Now Ino was hissing, her voice dropping lower, like a tiger readying itself for a leap. He died because we weren't good enough. What is there not to dash? Sai dropped his chopsticks, and they landed on the edge of his plate with an unusually loud clatter. The pale boy let out an annoyed grunt, staring at the fallen utensils, and reached out for them with trembling hands. The thick bandages wrapped around his fingers made the motion look clumsy and difficult. The former root operative had cut into the bones of his hand defending against his own blade in a megakur. It wasn't anything that couldn't be fixed by Konoha's accomplished medics, but it had only been 2 days. Ah, he said, with just a hint of frustration. His fingers gradually wrapped around his chopsticks, slowly bringing them back up as his whole arm tensed in concentration. Oh, cut it out. Ino snapped, plucking the wooden sticks from Sai's unresisting fingers. You're not supposed to be using your hands, dummy. Sai glanced at her with flat eyes. I'd rather not starve, he deadpanned. Ino narrowed hers in response. Open wide, then. She speared a piece of beef a little viciously and brought it up to Sai's face. The injured operative considered the steaming meat, and then shrugged extravagantly and opened his mouth. Kiba watched the Yamanaka feed Sai with a dull interest for several seconds, before turning to Koji. Beside him, Akamaru yipped and snagged a particularly large cut of meat. So you haven't seen him much? He asked. Koji nodded, squinting at Ino and Sai. Kiba frowned. Same for me. Not Shikamaru, I mean, he corrected himself. But I've barely seen Hinata and Shino. I don't know what they're up to. I haven't seen Sakura either, Ino cut in. I'm worried about her too. And? Why? Sai said through a mouthful of meat. Everyone at the table turned to him, including Akamaru. Why? Kiba echoed incredulously. Sai blinked back as Ino lowered some food away from his mouth, her own hanging open slightly. She looked almost angry, but as usual, Sai didn't seem to notice. He just swallowed and looked around with an innocent look. Why? He repeated. Sai, Ino said, sounding like a dam about to burst. Her voice bridled with suppressed violence, and the chopsticks in her hand splintered slightly. Koji just watched with narrowed eyes. After what happened in a megakur. But the mission succeeded, Sai said in a mild voice, frowning slightly. Akatsuki was destroyed, and Suzuki Uchiha was retrieved. And with no casualties. I don't dash. People died, idiot, Kiba growled, and Akamaru with him. The Inyazuka was bristling. Don't say bullshit like no casualties just because everyone made it back. Sai stared at him, and then at everyone else at the table. His injured hands twitched for a second, before relaxing. They're not dead, he said softly. No one is. It doesn't dash, Koji started to say, before the pale boy cut him off. Some of our comrades died in a megakur, he said carefully, making eye contact with the Akimichi. They gave our lives for us, Hinata and Niji Hyuga, Shikamaru Nara, Shino Abarame, Tenten, Rock Lee. They died so that we might accomplish the mission. He blinked. But they are not dead. Why are you all here, worrying about them, when they are out there, in the village, waiting for you? If you are worried for them, why are you not seeking them out? There was no answer to his question other than silence. Kiba, Ino, and Koji found themselves glancing at each other. The Yamanaka dropped Sai's chopsticks, and they landed on his plate with a muted clatter. I thought you were an idiot, Kiba asked with suspicion after a moment. Akamaru barked, cocking his head, and the Inyazuka looked back at him. Sai opened his mouth. No one there ever found out what he was going to say. Instead, what came out of his mouth was Suzuki. Kiba swung around, and Ino with him, her head jerking away from Sai. Koji took a bit longer, turning with a frown. Akamaru let out a confused yip, reflected by the look on Kiba's face. Neither nor the Inyazuka nor his partner had smelled the Uchiha approaching. Even if he'd been masked by the busy restaurant and their own distraction, that was unusual. Hello. Suzuki sounded amicable. Pleasant, almost. It was a bit disconcerting. The Uchiha had always been a terse, tense person, when he wasn't being silent. Sai smiled vacantly, and Kiba frowned. Why are you here? He asked. Suzuki told him. Suzuki Uchiha walked the streets of the village hidden in the leaves, and hardly a soul recognized him. He was older than when he'd left. 13-year-old Suzuki Uchiha, missing nin in all but name, had been a wiry boy with pale features and a blank face. He had been replaced by an imposing teen with dark eyes and a purposeful, stride. He walked like an experienced shinobi, but he didn't wear a hitayate, or any other emblems of the village. Nearly everyone he passed in the pleasant midday sun ignored him. Thanks to this, he slipped under their eyes as another unremarkable teenager in long black pants and a loose-fitting gray t-shirt. The more attentive ones noticed the presence he carried through the bustling roads. Civilians tended to frown and watch him for a moment before going on with their business, unsure of what the prickling, phantom itch on the back of their neck meant. A father tugged his daughter along, drawing her closer to himself. Shinobi did much the same, but some of them channeled minute amounts of chakra, just in case. Suzuki could taste it, like the hint of distant smoke in the air. The Umbu patrol of 2 men and 1 woman following him along the rooftops could feel it too. Suzuki was aware of the signals they were sending each other, as well as any shinobi below who reacted to him with too much shock. Ally, they were saying in the common simple sign language Konoha shared amongst its ninja. That was a strange thought to him, but it rang true, so Suzuki kept walking. He'd met with almost everyone, there were only 4 left now. Well, 5, but he didn't think he and Itaka would be meeting today. Whether it was intuition or internal resistance, Suzuki wasn't sure. There was something comforting about retracing the paths of his old village. Not much had changed, but what had stuck out to him, a felled wall here or there, a building expanded beyond its original dimensions, extended power lines or new restaurants. Subtle change had swept through the village. It was more colorful than Suzuki remembered, vivid red and green hung in tapestries and signs from the walls and overhangs, and the buildings themselves burst with cheerful light. He couldn't tell if his memories had dulled this place, or if now he was simply allowing himself to see it for what it was. He could have gone by the roofs, at speeds that would have left his Umbu escort behind, at least temporarily. Suzuki knew this. But he'd resolved to walk. What he was doing couldn't be rushed. It felt improper to do that. There was a cool breeze whispering through the street, and it rustled Suzuki's hair and made the banners hanging above the street flutter with soft sounds. He suppressed a sigh. He hadn't realized until he'd taken a shower how full of rust and blood and acidic rainwater his hair had been. His whole frame felt lighter, surer, since he'd returned from a megakur. With his brother's eyes, the world was clearer than ever. Suzuki. They let him identify the shinobi who had resolved to approach him before the man himself was even sure of his intent. Suzuki stopped. He waited, allowing the older shinobi to approach. He was surprised that the man didn't hesitate. Even when Sasuke met his eyes, he looked right back, meeting Sasuke's gaze. It was the rare ninja who did that to an Uchiha. The scar across the man's nose drew Sasuke's eye, and the brief trade of invisible recognition ended. Iruka, sensei. Sasuke affixed the honorific uncertainly, just slowly enough for the pause to be noticeable. Iruka Umino considered his old student. He shifted, just slightly, and something clinked in one of his many pouches. Whatever he was weighing, Sasuke didn't know, his body language gave away nothing. I thought it might be you, the teacher finally said, shaking his head as a rueful grin slipped into being. But I couldn't be sure. You really are back then? Technically, I was back 2 weeks ago, Sasuke said, and his academy teacher shrugged. You were in the hospital the whole time. Out of sight, out of mind, you know. Iruka looked him up and down. But now here you are. Walking around, and of your own will. His brow furrowed. Naruto really did it. Even after. He let the phrase dangle, but the both of them knew what he was talking about. HN. Another gust of wind swept lazily down the street. Sasuke looked past his teacher, then refocused on him. Have you seen him? I need to tell him something. Iruka frowned. I have. Where? He came to me, Iruka said. At the academy. Sasuke. I hope you don't mind if I take a minute of your time. He reached into one of his back pockets and removed something metallic and black. It took Sasuke a moment to realize what it was. A Hitayate. A strangely familiar one, as well. All of Konoha's forehead protectors were essentially the same, but Sasuke realized that he knew this one. Is that Naruto's? Yes, Iruka said, looking down at the Hitayate. He gave it to me. His lips twisted, and he took a deep breath in through his nose. Sasuke, I don't know what happened in Omegakure. The Hokages kept it locked down. All I know is he went there with half of his graduating class and Might Guy's team, and came back with you. Iruka took a step forward, his face hard. But you've got to tell me. Sasuke regarded him with a hint of uncertainty. Iruka had never showed this side of himself to his students at the academy. The Hokage dash. This is more important than whatever the Hokage thinks, Iruka said, his voice a cold blade. What happened in that village? What made Naruto give me back my Hitayate? My. Sasuke's eyebrows arched at that. He'd never known that Naruto's forehead protector had belonged to their former teacher. There was a slight lull in the pedestrian traffic, the street was mostly empty but for them. Sasuke wondered for a moment if he'd unconsciously driven it away. Or if Iruka had. The man was radiating threat. It couldn't be described any other way. Like a recently turned off stovetop, still hot to the touch. It wasn't threat directed towards Sasuke, though. It was aimless, it washed over the street and stifled the wind, before curling back in on itself in hopeless frustration. The leader of the Akatsuki forced Naruto to unleash the Kyuubi, Sasuke said after a moment, and Iruka sucked in a breath. He murdered all of Team Guy, Hinata Hyuga, Shikamaru Nara, and Shino Abarame before Naruto chose to. Everyone else was badly injured. Sasuke pressed on before Iruka could blink. And then, after Naruto and I managed to defeat him, he brought them back to life. Iruka couldn't respond to that with anything but silence. He stared at the Uchiha, his eyes wide. His facial scar stretched across his face, drawn taut by his shock. His directionless rage had been blown away, leaving him hollow and cool. You've had an interesting week, he finally said. Sasuke almost laughed. The academy teacher's face was pale, and his voice faint. It took a second, but Iruka's face hardened, and he thrust his hand out. The Hitayate in his palm caught a glint of the sun. You're going to give this back to him. Sasuke hadn't heard someone give him such a definite command in a long time. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Being independent had had its own perks. Then again, being independent had ended when he'd had his eyes ripped out. I couldn't get through to him, Iruka said. He grinned at his teeth just slightly as he did, but Sasuke didn't think he noticed. But if anyone can, it's going to be you, Sasuke. Iruka smiled, a bit bitterly. Find him, would you? Sasuke took the Hitai. Iruka stepped back, gave him a small nod of thanks, then turned away. The Uchiha continued down the road, leaving Iruka behind. In his peripheral vision, he saw the man's shoulders slump. His own straightened, Sasuke's whole body grew more focused. The sky was completely clear and blue, but nevertheless he could hear pounding rain, he could feel his body being drenched, his arms and chest and head aching. Sasuke could hear his mother, asking him a question as she tried to break his windpipe. And he could hear his answer. I did have a friend. The moment passed, the rain faded, and the words with them. But as he walked down the street away from his former teacher, Naruto's Hitai held loosely in one hand, Sasuke didn't forget them. It took him half an hour to find Naruto. In the end, all he had to do was look up. It was rude to climb over the Hokage monument. Or at least, Sasuke remembered it that way. That kind of thing was probably thrown out in favor of practicality in a life or death situation, but this wasn't one of them. So he took the long way up, moving along the side of the mountain rather than the face of it. Naruto was waiting for him at the top. Waiting, Sasuke knew, because Naruto definitely knew he was coming. The Uzumaki was sitting down cross-legged atop the carving of the Yondaime. He looked out over Konoha, his bright blonde hair moving in the wind, unrestrained by any Hitai. He didn't acknowledge Sasuke's presence, even as the Uchiha strode up and sank down beside him. There was a moment of silence, interrupted by nothing but the gently whistling wind. Konoha stretched out below them, miles and miles of tangled and vibrant buildings pulsing with the faint waft of something cooking or a snatch of sound, a bark of laughter or a half-heard word, floated up from the village. Beyond its walls, a forest of immense trees stretched for as far as the eye could see, a sea of whispering green. Hey, Sasuke eventually said. He looked over. Naruto didn't look back. Hey, the Jinchuriki said. He sounded slightly subdued. Sasuke kept watching him. Naruto's eyes were gold. Red pigmentation had spread around them, painting the area below his temple and above his nose a bright crimson. He was staring fixedly down at the village, but he caught Sasuke's head turning in his peripheral vision and turned his head slightly to meet his eyes for a moment. They didn't say anything, but Naruto's mouth twisted into a half-frown. He was the first to turn away, looking back at the village. Sasuke matched him, and after a moment, his Sharingan activated. It spooled out, eventually completely transforming into its star and shuriken shape. He memorized the hidden village below him with a glance, and then the red and black slid away. I'm feeling them, Naruto suddenly said, and Sasuke glanced back to him. The forest at their back murmured. The blonde's fixation with the village hadn't changed. It's like I can see every one of them. The village? Sasuke asked, and Naruto nodded. When I'm like this, he said, tapping the side of his head and indicating his golden eyes. I can sense chakra for miles around. It's kinda like how I found pain. Why are you up here, Naruto? Sasuke said, and Naruto blinked. He didn't answer the question immediately. Sasuke could see him turning it over in his head. You're not going to leave again, right Sasuke? He finally said. Answering a question with a question. Sasuke had to fight the urge to sigh. That was nothing like Naruto. Tell you what, he said, shifting his legs beneath him. If you answer my question, I'll answer yours. Naruto glanced over at him again, as if making sure he was still there. It was the only place I could be alone. Sasuke nodded. That made perfect sense to him. And I wanted to make sure, Naruto amended. He hesitated, before continuing. They both knew what he meant, but he needed to say it out loud anyway. That everyone was still alive. Sasuke leaned back. Of course they are, Naruto. Hey, I know that, Naruto shot back with just a little too much heat. But I just keep. You feel guilty, Sasuke said. Naruto's brow twitched. Duh, Naruto said bitterly. Now, he was actually meeting Sasuke's eyes. His own were narrowing. I know it's not my fault. Not really. Hinata even said so, right before. Sasuke cocked an eyebrow at the mention of the Hyuga as Naruto struggled with the words in his throat, before swallowing them down. It was Nagato. He was the one who. He drifted away, looking back over the monument. But I can't just forget. Or. He shook his head. I'm not making sense. Not really, Sasuke agreed, and for just a half-second Naruto fought a grin, before his face sobered once more. Sasuke waited a moment, and then pressed ahead. Is that why you gave Iruka your headband? Naruto stiffened. Hey, you gotta answer my question first. I'm not going to leave again, Sasuke said, almost impatiently. There was something gnawing at his gut, seeing Naruto so indecisive. It clashed too much with the idiot that he knew. This conversation was like one between strangers. Whatever he and Naruto had been before he left, they hadn't been strangers. Why did you give Iruka his headband back? He told you, huh, Naruto said, leaning back on two hands and closing his eyes. I couldn't hold onto it. Sasuke started to say something, but Naruto shut him up with a sharp look. Hinata, Shikamaru, Neji, Tenten, Lee, he said forcefully. Them dying wasn't my fault. I can work with that, even if I don't believe it right now. But Sasuke, I still fucked up. He leaned in just slightly, his face intensely focused. I shouldn't have been such an idiot and gone after you so quickly. I did exactly what Pain wanted, and everything almost went. He shook his head violently, bleeding frustration. It could have been none of us coming back from that. We got way too lucky. I should have trusted you to last longer in a Megakure. I should have trusted Bah-chan to let me go after you when I was ready, not just because I was angry and scared. She really laid into me yesterday, after we all got back. I thought she was gonna cave my head in, she was so angry. Naruto was talking faster than usual, and Sasuke just listened with a flat, calm look. So I gave my headband back to Iruka-sensei, Naruto continued. I'm gonna start over. I'm going to get a new one, and this time, I'm going to do better. I'm not going to fuck up like I did. I'm not going to let anyone else suffer because of my mistakes. The last word held in the air for a moment before being swept away by the breeze. Naruto's hair moved in it as he stared at Sasuke, his eyes begging him to understand. Sasuke did. Perfectly. You're running away. Naruto blinked. At the same time, his sage mode ran out, and his eye coloration returned to normal. He flinched, and spoke. What? Sasuke looked back out over the village. That's not your Nindo, is it, Naruto? Running away. What the hell are you talking about? Naruto hissed. He grabbed the front of Sasuke's shirt, jerking the Uchiha to face back towards him. Sasuke's calm expression didn't change and Naruto's fist violently trembled just below his face. This seemed familiar to him, and he knew Naruto was feeling it too. You want to start over, Sasuke said. He pulled Iruka's headband out from behind his back, and held it up. You thought that if you gave this back, you could begin again. Be a different shinobi. Naruto's face was twitching with rage, and Sasuke's lips thinned. You shouldn't do that, Naruto. The blonde regarded him with a predator's eyes, the same color as the sky above. This had happened before. Naruto had grabbed him, his hands shaking in rage, and asked him confused and angry questions. They'd even been on top of a giant stone head. But that time, Sasuke had been the one running away. And why not? Naruto growled. You don't run away from your mistakes, Sasuke said with conviction. He didn't have to say dumbass out loud for Naruto to know he was saying it anyway, and his friend's grip tightened. You turn and face them. Naruto's eyes went wide, and Sasuke's grip around his Hitai loosened. How long have you been watching the village, Naruto? From up here. About 3 hours, the Uzumaki bit out. Then you know where I've been, Sasuke said. Naruto let him go, and he had to put back a hand to steady himself as he fell back. Naruto got to his feet, and after a moment Sasuke joined him, Naruto's headband dangling from his hand. They faced each other from a meter away. Yeah, Naruto said, frowning. I saw. I didn't. The Hyuga, Hinata and Neji, as well as their clan's leader, Sasuke said. Might Guy, Tenten, and Rock Lee. He blinked at the memory of the three wrapped in a tearful embrace in the middle of a ruined training field. Ino Yamanaka, Kiba Inuzuka, Koji Akimichi. That Black Ops agent who goes by Sai. Shino Abarame. He finished with a deep breath. Now, all that's left is Sakura, Kakashi-sensei, Shikamaru Nara, and you. Naruto frowned. Why did you go to see them? You barely know most of them. To apologize, Sasuke said. The words flowed easily, but they were unusually heavy, and vanished quickly. And then, he dropped to one knee and lowered his head. His whole body felt like it was full of lead, and he was sure that weight wouldn't vanish until he was done here. Naruto blinked, cocking his head. Sasuke he said, before the Uchiha cut him off. I'm sorry, Sasuke said. He looked up. Naruto stared back, stricken. For running away. Sasuke, what the fuck are you doing? The Uchiha ignored him, searching for more. I'm sorry for going to Orochimaru. For putting a hole in your shoulder at the valley. For leaving, even after you proved we were equals there. Naruto gaped, speechless. I'm sorry for acting as I did when you came for me at Orochimaru's base in Sound. He considered, and gave the mental equivalent of a shrug. There was really only one thing to say. I shouldn't have left. Naruto made a sound like a balloon slowly deflating. What? I told you I met my parents in a megakure. Sasuke took a slow, heavy breath, before blowing it all and emptying his chest. We talked. Not for nearly long enough. But my mother and father, they made me see some things differently. I imagine it as much the same for you. Naruto's eyes fell. It wasn't enough time. No, Sasuke agreed. Not nearly. They stayed like that for another couple seconds, and slowly, Naruto relaxed. His shoulders dropped, and his hands, which had been balled into fists, unclenched. Aren't you going to get up? He said. Only if you accept my apology, Sasuke said. Naruto gave him the ghost of a grin. I accept your apology, Sasuke. He lowered his hand. Thank you. Sasuke allowed Naruto to pull him to his feet. The Uzumaki's Hitai was held in the same hand Sasuke extended, both of the shinobi had a hold on it. Sasuke started to pull away, and Naruto instinctively tightened his grip on the piece of metal. I'm not going to let you make such a moronic mistake, Sasuke said, the words less brutal than they should have been. You're going to live with them. Naruto looked at the forehead protector, and then at Sasuke, his mouth twisting. He pulled the band away, and Sasuke let him take it. Heh, Naruto snorted as his hands fully closed around the sun-warmed metal. He squeezed it, just a bit, and then showed Sasuke a real smile. We've got to get yours back too, then. Sasuke sighed. Of course you still have it. Naruto raised his eyebrows. Of course I do. You think I'd let you forget I managed to put a scratch on it? The Uchiha grimaced. I suppose it's in your apartment then. Course. Same one it's always been, Naruto confirmed. Slowly but surely, the animus Sasuke was familiar with was returning. HN, Sasuke said. He turned, putting his back to the blonde. Race you there. Then he leapt of the monument. As the wind whistled in his ears and he picked up speed, hurtling down towards the village at a higher and higher velocity, he heard a distant, unmistakable yell. You bastard! Tsunade interlaced her fingers, leaning into her desk and blowing out a long breath. Her hands came up, masking her mouth. Her office was completely silent, despite being well occupied. She regarded the translucent container in front of her. It was such a small thing, barely bigger than her fist, but the small orb floating in the clear fluid it held was dominating her thoughts. She half groaned. Jiraiya, who was standing to the side of her desk, cocked an eyebrow. She could feel it. Fortunately, he didn't say anything. Tsunade wasn't sure if she would have put him through a wall or not if he had. Her mind was racing, weighing possibilities. You're sure? She asked for the second time. Itaki Uchiha, quietly waiting in front of her desk, nodded politely. It was still a bit surreal to see that, Tsunade thought. Less than a month ago, she would have killed him on sight. Now, they were meeting in her office. "I'm sure," he said. He certainly sounded it, though there was a minute hitch in his voice. He shifted in his simple dark clothes, a small sign of discomfort. Tsunade wouldn't have seen it if she weren't watching for it in the first place. Even after her personal attention, the hole that had been ripped in Itaka's side had been a brutal injury. If the Uchiha hadn't cauterized it, he almost certainly would have bled out before Sakura could have stabilized him. Sakura can attest as well. Tsunade turned to her apprentice, standing beside Itaka. The pink-haired girl glanced uncertainly at the former missing nin, before looking back to her master. She nodded as well. "I crushed it," she said confidently. "I found a bit of the residue on the scene, the pigmentation couldn't be mistaken. And..." She hesitated. "I'm sure I heard it." The Hokage almost grinned at how squeamish her apprentice looked. The sound of eyeballs being crushed didn't breach the top 5 on a list of disgusting sounds she'd heard. Sakura may have been a genius when it came to medical ninjutsu, but here her relative lack of field work was showing. "So," she said, redirecting her attention to the container in front of her. "We have the only Rinnegan in existence then." The eyeball bobbed, as if in assent, and Tsunade frowned. Hopefully, Jiraiya spoke up with an edge of humor, and Tsunade looked over to him. Her teammate grinned back at her. "Who knows? Maybe there's some monk running around out there with this thing who hasn't seen another man in a century or two." Tsunade rolled her eyes. "You've been writing too much again." "Fine, the only known Rinnegan in existence. Does that make you feel better?" Jiraiya made a half bow with a smarmy grin, and Tsunade snorted. She looked back to Sakura and Itaka. "Now," the Hokage said, "what to do with it?" "Huh?" Sakura asked. Tsunade gestured at the bobbing eye. "What do we do with it?" "AHH." Sakura hesitated, looking to both the older shinobi in the room. Itaka looked back at her without a change in expression, but the Harano was somehow sure he was laughing at her. Or at least chuckling. Jiraiya didn't offer anything either, he just raised an eyebrow. "Sensei," she said slowly. "Shouldn't you, talk to the Jonin Council? Maybe the elders?" "Why dash? I'm asking you, Sakura." Tsunade was perhaps enjoying seeing her student squirm more than she should. What should the village do with this enormous power that's fallen into its hands? Well. The Harano hesitated again. "We could give it to one of our more powerful shinobi." She inclined her head towards Jiraiya, and the Toad Sage snorted. "If they were willing to undergo the procedure, of course. Pain was an incredible enemy, having one of him on our side would be a boon." "I wouldn't take it," Jiraiya spoke up, shaking his head. "I already lost one arm, no need to lose an eye as well." He grinned. "I'm rather fond of them, you know." "And that would risk it falling into enemy hands," Sakura said, one of her arms moving behind her back to grasp the other. She really was nervous. Tsunade's apprentice bit her lip. "It wouldn't be a practical use of resources. Something like this is way too big to send out into the field, especially after." She glanced at Itaka, and then back to Tsunade. "Well, especially after Sasuke and his brother have returned to the village." There was a hitch in her voice on the first part of that sentence, Tsunade noted. She didn't blame Sakura. So much had changed in the last couple weeks. So giving it to someone would be wasteful, Sakura concluded. It would be much better to keep it here, in the village, and study it. Maybe you could figure out how it grants the kind of power it does, Master. No one knows the human body better than you. Jiraiya blinked, and Tsunade crushed the urge to backhand him out of the tower. Instead, she just smiled at the compliment. "The thought had occurred to me." Sakura smiled, but her gaze wandered back to the eye floating in the jar. Tsunade didn't think much of it, it was certainly an unusual sight. However, Itaka must have seen something she couldn't. The Uchiha spoke up. "There's something else," he said, pinning Sakura with his flat eyes. The Harano narrowed her own, staring back, before shrugging. There was clear hesitation on her face, but she spoke anyway. "It's stupid," she said. "There's no way you haven't already thought of it." "Oh. Jiraiya asked. He grinned. Go ahead. You might be surprised by what folks like us miss. Sakura crossed her arms, staring at the eye for another couple seconds. You could destroy it. Tsunade raised an eyebrow. I know, Sakura shook her head. I'm only saying it because you asked. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts, before pressing ahead. Itachi watched her with interest. The Rinnegan is an unbelievable kind of power. It let Pain take on the Kyuubi. He didn't win, but he and Naruto nearly leveled the village fighting each other. The ghost of a shiver traveled down Sakura's body, and Tsunade frowned behind her hands. The other villages, if they knew that we had something like the Rinnegan in our hands. Sakura shrugged. Well, it's pretty scary, isn't it? Pain somehow used it to bring everyone who died back to life. You saw it, Jiraiya-sama. The Toad Sage nodded, his lips pursing. Tsunade knew he must have been remembering his final meeting with his student. I never would have thought that was possible, but he managed it from the edge of death. Sakura let out a shuddering breath, her body shaking slightly as she finished her speech. So who else knows what this eye is capable of? It might be that destroying it now will be better. If one of the other major villages ever finds out that we've got it, they're not going to stand by. They couldn't afford to. You think there could be a war over it? Tsunade asked. She noticed something cold slip into Itachi's eyes, like a layer of frost covering a cracked stone. Sakura frowned. I'm only 17, sensei. 50 years ago, I probably would have been fighting a war my whole life, but today, I've never even seen one. Her lips pursed. I don't know. There was a silence in the office, despite the brightness outside. Itachi eventually pierced it. There is another factor, he said, and everyone looked to him. What Madara he blinked, before resettling himself. What Obito Uchiha was trying to accomplish, crafting his infinite Tsukuyomi, however he was going to do it, he needed the Rinnegan to do it. But he's disabled, Jiraiya pointed out. Your Koda Amatsukami saw to that. If you really struck him, there's no way he'll recover. Of course, Itachi conceded. He almost seemed uncomfortable. He had allies, though most of them are gone now. And Zetsu possessed him and enabled his escape. The Uchiha silently pondered for a moment. So long as this eye exists, the possibility of the infinite Tsukuyomi does as well. It didn't need to be said that that was a bad thing. Tsunade mulled the uncomfortable Uchiha's words over. Being sealed into an endless dream certainly wasn't in her future plans. And Itachi was, of course, correct, as was Sakura. The Rinnegan was dangerous. Its existence could cause as much or more trouble as any possible gains it could make for Konoha. But Jiraiya's hand being laid on her shoulder startled her, and the Hokage jumped. She hadn't noticed her teammate move. She looked up to find him giving her one of his unusually serious looks. It comes down to this, I think, he said confidently, before gesturing at the eye. We either keep it to further Sensei's dream, safeguard the will of fire, and strengthen the village dash. And give Nagato's death some meaning, Tsunade could imagine him saying. It was obvious how his student's fate weighed on him, his forced humor over the last 2 days was as obvious as the sun rising. Or we can destroy it because we're afraid, her teammate finished with a grimace. Sakura looked uncertain at the proclamation, but Itachi lifted his head slightly. Jiraiya's hand settled back down on Tsunade's shoulder, and he squeezed. Are you afraid, Haim? The Hokage of the village hidden in the leaves considered the question. Are you afraid? Akatsuki was all but destroyed. The village had gained the last of its wayward Uchiha. Jiraiya had escaped certain death. Naruto had made a fatal, stupid mistake, but it hadn't permanently taken the lives of any Leaf Shinobi. She doubted he'd ever want to use the Kyuubi again, though. Orochimaru was still out there somewhere, with a workable Edo Tensei jutsu. The other villages were doubtlessly shifting, there'd be a change in the wind soon. Tsunade finally said. Her hands came down flat on the desk, and she pushed herself up. Sakura, she declared, and the younger woman snapped to attention. You're still my apprentice. The Harano blinked and nodded, and Tsunade showed her teeth. She gestured to the Rinnegan with an open palm, her eyes both warm and challenging. "Consider this your graduation test, then," the Hokage proclaimed. Sakura's mouth fell slightly open. "Unlock the secrets of this eye, and you will have truly surpassed me." "Dash." The medic gaped, before bowing. "Of course, Hokage-sama." "None of that crap," Tsunade dismissed, and Sakura came back up. "I'll get you your own facility, this will probably consume much of your time. Don't be surprised if you aren't going on as many missions as you used to." Sakura muttered, still mostly speechless. "I won't let you down, Shishao." "I don't think you will, Sakura," Tsunade said, and the meeting came to an end. Behind her, a paper airplane began insistently tapping at the window. Kakashi Hatake sat alone in the dark and glared at the back of his eyelids. His hands, clasped together between his knees, were trembling. They gripped each other, the knuckles widening. He wasn't wearing his gloves, or any of the rest of his shinobi accoutrements. They were all folded or stacked and put away in various alcoves across his rather bare apartment. Kakashi couldn't bear to have them all in the same place. Now, all he was wearing was a plain black shirt and long pants. He was practically invisible on his bed, his feet resting on the floor, his head bowed. From outside came the faint sound of children shrilly yelling, but Kakashi ignored it. He was straining, his head pounding. Slowly, the rest of the world stopped existing. He stopped seeing the back of his eyelids. It was still black. Still utterly lacking in light. But this was a different kind of darkness. It wasn't created by shut windows, slammed doors, and drawn curtains. It was the kind of blackness that came from something actively devouring the light that dared touch it. It was a kind of dark that made Kakashi feel small and furious. He fought the urge to light a rakery. This blackness was nowhere near him. He knew it in his bones, even if it felt like it was right in front of him. It had been like this in a Megakure. This kind of dark. His eye had been aching, an agonizing, pulsing burn, since that day. When he'd burst from the rain, his hand a line of electric death, turning everything around him a pale shade of blue. The living shadow had jumped, barely dodging a blow that would have vaporized everything behind its ribs. And as it had jumped, that seething yellow eye, like a rotten lemon, had turned to glare at Kakashi. And suddenly he was looking at himself. There was a desperate red glint behind that flat yellow eye. A pinwheel. It was and wasn't a reflection of Kakashi's own crimson Sharingan, a mirrored image laid over itself. He was watching himself as he slipped below the shadow. He could see himself looking back. Resonance. That hadn't been Madara. It hadn't been Zetsu, that peculiar living shadow. That had been Obito. Obito was alive. Kakashi had been a shinobi all his life. He'd found his father face down on their living room floor, a kunai buried so deeply in his heart that the hilt was barely visible, before he'd turned 6. He'd killed just over 300 people with his bare hands. He'd made 233 of those kills with the Sharingan active. He could remember them in perfect detail if he so much as closed his eyes. He'd murdered his best friend with the jutsu he'd invented, and saw her face, streaked with blood, mud, tears, and rain, every night before he fell asleep. Kakashi had been a shinobi all his life. So now, 2 days later and in the darkness of his apartment, he didn't question how his friend could be alive, or how he'd come to identify as Madara Uchiha, leader of the Akatsuki. Instead, he poured as much chakra into his Sharingan as he could. The darkness made more and more sense to him. He was staring through Obito's other eye, the one that had stayed in his friend's head. Zetsu was still molded over the man, there was nothing to see but shadows. The Hatake stayed like that for over 2 hours, sitting perfectly still as the day slowly ticked away. The shadow shifted, whirling and churning, but remained. Occasionally, Kakashi started to think its movement was all in his imagination. He was barely breathing, his heart beat once every 2 seconds. He was nearing the edge of chakra exhaustion, sitting there with the Sharingan active for so long. Eventually, he would pass out, and then the darkness would be an entirely natural one. But he couldn't stop looking. He couldn't stop hoping that he'd see something. His eye twinged, a phantom pain. Suddenly, the shadow receded. Obito fell to a hard stone floor, and the shadow slithered away from him. It had been as foregone as gravity, now it was gone. There was no sound. Kakashi could only see, after all. But less than a second later, Obito was alone on the ground. He stared ahead, his vision still as stone. If it weren't for the incredibly subtle shift in angle as the Uchiha's head rocked with his breathing, it would have been impossible to tell if he were even alive. Kakashi kept watching. He didn't even have to tell himself to remember everything he saw. The Sharingan did it for him. What he could see was unremarkable. It was a room with roughly cut stone walls and floor. There was a fire somewhere, casting a flickering, warm light over the wall. It looked cold. In the corner of Obito's vision, the Hatake could see the edge of a desk, made of plain wood and stacked with empty flasks. There was a purple smear on the ground in the center of the Sharingan's vision, as if someone had taken a violet paintbrush to a pile of rice. It was lumpy and misshapen, and hummed with chakra. Nothing happened for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, but for occasional slovenly blinks turning the world dark for brief moments. Blackness started to edge into Kakashi's vision. Then, someone turned Obito over. He limply flopped, staring straight upwards. A pale, cruel face stared down, a smile stretching inhumanly across it. Its slit yellow eyes narrowed in mad glee. The mouth moved. Kakashi couldn't hear anything, but he could read lips. "What an unexpected gift," Orochimaru said. He bent down. Kakashi cursed, and blacked out. Check the description for the links to the author.